G'day mates, it's Busta here, and I would like to give Native a huge shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, I believe in working hard and investing in yourself. I mean, that's the point of working hard, right? You work hard to reward yourself with premium products that mirror your lifestyle. And that is what got me into Native. And honestly, I cannot recommend Native enough. As someone who has bought their stuff again and again, I can truly say now that they have never let me down. The fragrances are amazing every time. The delivery has always been timely, and it's really reassuring to me that I know that I'm using effective and safe products every time that I go to the bathroom. For instance, aluminium forms a plug in your sweat glands to keep you from sweating. That's why Native never uses ingredients like aluminium, parabens, sulfates, or talc. But switching to an aluminium-free deodorant doesn't mean you have to sacrifice on odor protection. Native will keep you smelling and feeling fresh all day long. My Native deodorant doesn't just block odor better as well, it's made better. Native has ingredients that you've heard of, like coconut oil, shea butter, and tapioca starch. It's also vegan and never tested on animals. With over 10 scents, including rotating seasonals, Native has something for everyone. Their most popular classic scents are coconut and vanilla, lavender and rose, cucumber and mint, and citrus and herbal. And I gotta say, too, that I think I may have found a new contender for the eucalyptus scent. I think my new favorite now is the cucumber and mint one. It honestly has the best smell ever. And some good news too is that Native is also risk-free to try. Every product comes with free shipping within the US, plus free 30-day returns and exchanges. See why so many people love Native and check out the over 14,000 5-star reviews now. Oh, and lastly, I also just want to mention that they have this great initiative going on at the moment that I've been really impressed by. It's called the Plastic Free by 23 initiative. Native currently is pushing really hard to try and provide a plastic-free option for every single one of their products and donating 1% of every plastic-free sale to non-profits specializing in environmental stewardship, which personally I think is awesome. So, do what I did and make the switch to Native today by going to nativedeo.com/scared or use the promo code SCARED at the checkout and get 20% off your first order. That's nativedeo.com/scared or use the promo code SCARED at the checkout for 20% off your first order. So I'm a police officer in a city of about 30,000 people, and I'm currently assigned to our midnight shift, working the hours of 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Now, at the beginning of my shift, I'm called to a house in what can be described as the wealthiest part of the town. I'm told by dispatch that the resident of the house, a teenage girl, believes that an adult male is attempting to enter the home. I activated my lights and sirens and arrived at the home a short time later. I knock on the door and I make contact with the caller, a frantic 18-year-old girl. My sergeant arrives on the scene a short time later. I ask her to describe what happened, and she explains that while laying on the couch, she heard pounding on the front door. She then looked out the peephole and didn't see anyone. She then heard banging on the back sliding glass door and screaming coming from outside. Again, she didn't see anyone. We ask if anyone made entry into the home, and the complainant denies this. My sergeant and I check the area, finding no prints in the yard. We also check the dew on the grass, finding it to be undisturbed. We also checked the glass for fingerprints and were unable to locate any, and we just chalked it up to the girl's friends playing a prank on her or her having an overactive imagination, and we leave the house. Approximately 3 hours later, though, we're called back to the residence. We are notified that the female believes someone to be inside the home this time. I beat my partner to the house by approximately 3 to 4 minutes. I enter and begin speaking with the complainant, who is visibly shaken again. I'm told that she was awoken by more banging and a man saying, "I know you're in there." The complainant states that she had barricaded the basement door with a chair, as she believes that someone could easily enter the home through the attached garage. I tell her to stay put in the living room, and I go to search the basement and the garage. I draw my firearm and search the basement. During my search, I must admit that I feel very uneasy, as if I'm being watched. I complete my search though as my partner arrives, and I walk back upstairs and meet with her and tell her that I haven't cleared the rest of the home yet. She draws her weapon and helps me search the rest of the home. The last room we enter belongs to the complainant, and it's her bedroom. And inside the bedroom, we find a Ouija board to be in plain view. We deem the residence safe and go back to the living room, and at this point, the complainant is frantically shaking and crying. We ask if she lives alone, and she states that she stays with her grandparents. She also states that they're out of town on business. She says that she is frequently home alone due to her grandparents being out of town on business and whatnot. I ask to call and speak with her grandpa, and I speak with him and learn that the complainant doesn't have any mental health issues, nor any behavioral issues. The complainant also does not use any form of drugs that he knows of, besides nicotine. Grandpa states that he's going to call another family member to come look after the complainant. We speak with the complainant again, learning that she doesn't currently suffer from any mental health issues. The complainant admits to smoking weed occasionally, but not partaking on any of the night of the disturbance. The complainant also advised us that she found the Ouija board that day hidden in a closet of the home. Her condition further degraded, and she requested that we take her somewhere else. But my partner, being a female officer, transported the complainant back to her HQ, where she was picked up by a family member at a later time. I stayed at the home and searched the surrounding area again, and I again didn't locate any signs of a person being outside the home. I don't know if this is the right place to post this out, but I believe this girl may have experienced something, truly. I mean, I for sure didn't feel good while being in that basement. I used to be a huge skeptic of the paranormal until I took this job. However, I've experienced and dealt with multiple things that I couldn't explain in regard to the calls to service. My partner also stated to feel very uneasy while being in the house too. Anyway, any one of you guys think that we may have stumbled across something, or did we just feed into the paranoia of a young girl who was just home alone? Unfortunately, I haven't been called out to the home ever since, so I've not got to investigate into this occurrence any further. But thanks for listening, though, to my experience, and thanks for anyone who may respond. So this happened about 15 years ago in a small town in Iceland. I was staying for Christmas with my ex-girlfriend's family. Her mother and grandmother lived in that town, and this happened in her grandmother's house. But we had visited her a couple of days earlier and stayed for lunch. It's not a big house, and I got pretty familiar with the surroundings that day. I remember walking the hallway to get to the bathroom, and I had to put my hand before my eyes because of the sun brightening up the place. I went in, locked the door, did my thing, and in the middle of it, the door just unlocked. It made this loud click when locking and unlocking, and I didn't think of it as something noteworthy. Old houses and all that, right? When I got out and I headed back to the living room, the hallway was just suddenly pretty dark. I just thought the clouds must have come over the place. Icelandic weather really shifts fast. But the second visit was supposed to be a longer stay, and we were to stay and help the old lady with chores and all that, and have dinner later that day. It was a beautiful winter day in Iceland too. Sunny, no clouds in the sky, cold and no wind outside. So we sat in the living room just relaxing and me watching the football on the TV. The ladies decided to go shopping and they left me alone to watch the game. Now, in a living room with big windows, sunny clear day, you would feel really relaxed, right? But I just always had a nagging feeling that I wasn't really safe in this house. I can't explain it, but I just felt uneasy in there alone. But that feeling just got more and more localized towards the hallway as the game went on. I felt that I had to glance in that direction, and I don't know why, but I just had to do it. Again, the hallway was getting darker and darker, which was weird because the sun was still shining outside and there were no clouds in the sky. But at one point, it really just hit me. An overwhelming feeling of just panic that I was going to get hurt staying in there. In a split second, I stood up from the couch and I looked towards the hallway, and it was pitch black, and I mean that black that you couldn't see anything else in this darkness. And the worst part was that it was heading my way, slowly, turning this bright winter day into the coldest, darkest night. It didn't make any noise, and everything just got really quiet. I could only hear my own breathing and pulse, in fact. I honestly felt like I was in extreme danger, and at this point, I just ran out. I didn't speak to my ex about it for a long time, and at that time, I played it like I had to get something at her mother's place. I made excuses not to have to visit that house again, in other words. But when I told her about it, she told me a lot of stories from her childhood. From things getting thrown around to doors opening and shutting and noises with just no clear origin. Anyway, I just wanted to share my experiences. I still think about it from time to time. It's not happened to me again, both before and after that experience. But it sure is something that I'll never forget. So, there's this annual event that takes place in Sana'a University Library. It's in Yemen, and basically it's a group of publishing houses from around the world would gather in the library and sell their books. My mum really loves books, and she reads like 3 or 4 books every month, sometimes even more. She had already graduated from the university, but her love for books kept her going back to that event almost every year. This story took place in 1997, 1 year after my birth. My mum was pregnant with my sister, and she was in her 9th month, so she was pretty huge at the time. So she went to the event in its final days. There wasn't a lot of people other than the booksellers. My mum had already bought a couple of books too, and was just looking for a certain book, and she kept asking around for it. She noticed, though, that there was a guy following her, but he kept a distance, so she didn't give him much attention. She finally arrived at one of the publishing houses and asked the guy who was working there for the book that she was looking for, and he told her that the book is not allowed to be sold in this country, so she won't be able to find it anywhere. And at that moment, that guy that was following my mum showed up all of a sudden and said to my mum, "I have that book that you're looking for." My mum was surprised and didn't know what to say to that guy, but he continued talking and said, "I saw the books that you bought, and I really like your taste." My mum just smiled and thanked him, and then he said, "I can give you the book that you're looking for." She said that it was okay, and the book is not really that important, but he insisted and said, "I'm a professor in this university, and my name is Muhammad Adam. Don't worry, nothing will happen to you. I'll leave the book with my assistant. Next Sunday, come by my office, and I'll let my assistant give it to you." He kept telling her not to worry and not to be scared and nothing will happen to her, and he was nice and kind of creepy at the same time, and she didn't think too much of it though. She just said, okay, and she just went back home. She then asked my father to take her to the university on Sunday so she can take the book. A few days went by, and on Sunday morning, my mum's water broke, so my father rushed her to the hospital and she gave birth to my sister, and just forgot about the whole book thing. After a few weeks, we travelled to another country, and about 3 years later, I think, my mum heard in the news that a serial killer named Muhammad Adam was arrested in the university, and her mind exploded when they showed a picture of the man and told my father that this was the same man who offered to give her the book a few years ago. They both were really glad that my sister's timing couldn't have been more perfect, because that man murdered more than 10 female students in horrible and really disturbing ways that's just so hard to imagine. And the man was then trialed and sentenced to death. So my house backs onto a small road that is parallel to a few large fields that are momentarily filled with large cows and a massive bull. This means that I haven't been able to walk my dog on there for a while, and instead I've started walking around the block with her. Really though, she needs to be able to run freely, so I decided last night, as it was a warm evening, I'd walk her up to the woods just past the old pit. Technically, you aren't supposed to be in those woods because, well, you have to walk across the privately owned pit land to access them. But the woodland itself isn't privately owned, so this being said, I was sure that I could let her off the lead and she could bolt around and burn off some excess energy. Now, the whole walk there was pretty much normal. The people I often see just jogging or walking their own dogs, waving at me. I waved back. I stopped and spoke to an old lady too, who said that she had a dog just like mine. Walking across the pit was a little scary. It always is though. More just the thought of being caught by security guards or even just one of the local busybodies. Entering the woods was fine though, slightly slippery as I headed down into the slightly more dense woodland. And then me and my dog, finally made it to the walking path. I've lived in this neighborhood for 6 years and I have no idea where this path starts, finishes, or what it even is for. Something tells me though that it has to do with minecarts. There are a couple that are upturned and decorated with graffiti and shrubbery, planted in the forest ground near to the path. But last night, I wasn't in any rush, so I thought to myself, let's see where this takes us. I unclipped my dog's lead and she pranced off in front, stiffing from side to side and constantly turning back to see where I was. She had never been down there with me, the reason being that I'd only been down there as a teenager really, and hadn't been there for a couple of years at this point. But nevertheless, my dog was pretty inquisitive of her surroundings. She didn't stray off from the dirt pathway though. But we'd been walking down the track for about 15 minutes I think, and I was already kind of lost. I knew that I'd know where I was once we turned back though, and figured that a 45-minute walk was probably enough for her, so I called her and we turned directly around and started walking back in the same direction that we had just come from. But this is where things got a bit odd. So we reached a spider web of a crossroads that I hadn't noticed on the way there. There were 6 pathways that all met in that spot. 2 of them were very close together, and I had no idea which path I had previously walked down. I looked down both paths, trying to familiarize myself with them, but I couldn't. I decided that I should probably go down to the left path. The reason for this is that the pit was on my right while I was walking down the path, so it made sense that it would be on the left walking back up. But left was more logical in my mind. Confused and slightly spooked though, we continued walking, and I only became more confused and freaked out. Because I noticed a couple of times a woman's clothing just hooked on a tree. It was something lacy, like a blouse or a pair of tights and a pair of panties, and I thought it was gross at first, but then my mind started asking, why? Why were they there? Who left them there? I called my dog and hooked her up on the lead, and I held her close. I was almost running at this point. Something bad was just in the air, and I could feel it in my stomach. When I heard sounds from the trees and saw shadows in the corner of my eyes. All of them could have been nothing, I admit. Animals, bushes, literally just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard a faint whimper coming from the direction that we were heading. My dog's ears perked up too, and she began to whine, and then again a moan, like whoever it was could have been in pain. I crept forward, but the sound continued, getting louder, turning into a more aggressive cry, but no words. Nobody asked for help or shouted hello. I was very scared, obviously, and I was frozen, pretty much solid. I grabbed my phone though, and I pressed the unlock button so I could then click the emergency call button on my lock screen if I needed to, and I shouted in confusion and fear, hello? Nobody replied though, and instead there was a guttural scream. It was definitely a woman, and her scream was ear-piercing, but drew total silence after it. But then she wailed even louder, and then again and again and again, and at this point I had tears in my eyes and I just ran straight out of there. The sound felt like it was getting closer and closer too, like I was running toward it, but I didn't want to run away into the woods where I would definitely get lost. I just ran and ran down this path, and I swear that my eyes were closed the whole time because the last thing that I remember was seeing the red light atop of the lighting mast attached to the pit building. I ran up the rocky banking and bolted through the chain link fencing. I took a moment to breathe and to calm down, to try and logically explain what had happened. But to be honest, I just couldn't. In the end, I called the cops as well. I don't think I could have slept without calling them. They called back this morning and reassured me too that they didn't find anything, not even the clothing that I saw. It was the summer of 1974. My aunt had come over in her Volkswagen Beetle to ask us kids if we wanted to go and see Herbie Rides again at the theatre. We were all pretty excited about seeing the movie and riding in a new purple VW, so the answer was definitely yes. The ride there wasn't as fun as I imagined it would be though, because my aunt was driving a stick shift for the first time. But after the stressful ride, we made it to the theatre. We got our refreshments and even talked my aunt into letting us sit in the balcony. I got my usual, sweet tarts and a large pop. I shouldn't have got that pop because I couldn't finish the movie without having to go to the bathroom. And sure enough, before the movie was halfway through, I got that urge to go. Missing part of the movie, though, was only a small part as to why I didn't want to go to that bathroom. The biggest reason was that it was in the basement of the building, and it was just a scary place to me. Almost every time that I'd gone down there before, too, I was always alone. The stairway went right down to the last few steps at the bottom, where it turned 90 degrees to the right. After turning at the bottom of the stairs, there was a large lobby there, and it was beautiful with ornamental chandeliers and stonework and the whole thing. Not a place you would think of as eerie or creepy, I suppose, but for some reason it was always just scary to be down there alone. One thing that I had noticed while being down there was that I couldn't hear the movie down in that lobby unless it was a very loud part. But when I got into the bathroom and closed the door, it sounded like the party was going right on outside that door. But the sounds never sounded like the movie at the time, though. I always tried to just hold it until the end of the movie when there would be others down there when I went, but this was just one of those times that I couldn't wait. So I went to the basement stairway and I noticed a boy about my age turning into the lobby at the bottom of the stairs. He had straight blonde hair and was wearing a light blue shirt and black pants. I was really happy to see him going down there, if I'm being honest, since I didn't have to be alone down there. I skipped stairs going down as quick as I could. I figured that he would almost be going into the restroom when I got to the lobby. I got down to the lobby, and when I did, there was nobody there. My excitement was turned to fear at that moment. I hesitated for a few seconds and wondered how he could have gotten into the bathroom before I got down to the lobby. From the bottom of the stairs to the bathroom door was twice the distance that it was from the top of the stairs to the bottom, and I practically ran down those stairs. I rationalized that he must have ran to the bathroom or went into the women's restroom or something. I really didn't think that he went into the women's restroom, so I was going with the idea that he must have run. I went into the bathroom though, figuring that I would see him in there, but when I did, there was nobody there. I was really scared, but I just couldn't convince myself that he didn't go into the women's restroom. But that was the only thing that made sense. So I finished my business as quick as I could, flushed, and I started washing my hands. And while washing my hands, one of the toilets in the stall flushed. And at first, I felt relieved because this meant that the boy was in there and I just didn't see his feet under the stall. But after a few seconds, when I didn't hear anything else and he didn't come out, I went over toward the stall and I asked if anyone was in there. I didn't get a response, so I walked closer to the stalls and noticed that the stall doors were open and there was nobody in either of them. It was now that I immediately ran out of there and back up to the movie. For the rest of the movie, I was looking all through there for the boy that I saw on the stairs instead of watching the movie. And I didn't see him anywhere there. When the movie was over too, I watched everyone coming out to see if he was there, but he wasn't. And I guess that I can be grateful that at least the ride home wasn't as scary as it was getting there after that. And that was the only time that I think that I have ever seen an apparition in my life. As a young kid, I lived in a city with my single mother. She had me at 17, so she and I have a lot of the same interests, and she's a very caring and loving mother. Never blamed me for ruining her life or anything like that. It was a pretty good childhood, if I'm being honest. She ran into an old friend, though, when I was 9 or so, and married him about 8 months later. Well, we fixed up his city house and sold it to move into a bigger house in the country. Now, this house is a nice house. It wasn't sold cheap like in the movies to try and trick people with a low price tag into buying a haunted house or anything. We got about 100 acres of dense forest, in fact, and the house was bought from an old man whose wife died a year earlier and wanted to move to a trailer park. I didn't get to see the house until after they bought it. Biological dad was driving me home after the weekend with him, and I was like, "Where are you taking me?" And when I walked into the place, it immediately just gave me a really bad vibe. My room had a high-angled ceiling, and at night in the country dark, I thought that I saw figures on the ceiling. Now, I wasn't an idiot. I knew your mind could play tricks on you, especially at night. I figured that it was just my imagination. I would start to hear walking in the night, on the roof of my room or in the hallways. I started sleeping with my radio on, so I didn't have to hear it. I would also wake up with bruises on my limbs sometimes, looking like fingers, and sometimes like I just got smacked. And then my mum got pregnant with my brother, and it was not a pleasant one. He was born at 6 months, and my mother nearly died from hemorrhaging. She was told that she couldn't have children anymore, and also couldn't breastfeed my brother, as she did for me. But I was about 12 now, and my mum fell asleep on the couch with my 3-month-old brother. And at the time, a random fire just started against the wall that she was sleeping by from the outside. The fire department said that it was because we didn't put out our campfire, but we hadn't had one in weeks, and it rained heavily the night before. Plus, the fire started in the front of the house, and we had our fire pit in the back. All of this meant that the addition to the house was lost, and we stayed in the original part until it was rebuilt. But during this time, the events happening to me got more severe after this. At one stage, people thought that my parents were beating me. I had so many bruises. I just wore jeans year-round so that no matter how hot it was, nobody would see it. But one of the worst was that I just felt cold fingers touching me, often too, even when I wasn't alone, and the left half of my bed was now always cold too. My parents say that no events happened to them, and they chose to believe the fire department about the fire, so I just kept things to myself and told people that I must be hitting myself in my sleep to get the marks or something. But the creepiest thing that has ever happened was when I had to move back in after college. But they had a dog now, a huge thing too, and I was going to bed around 4 a.m. and left my room to turn off the light. My stepdad always forgot it. I turned off the last one and was walking back to my room, and I brushed past the dog. I pet him in the dark and then continued to my room, which is at the top of the stairs. I looked to the bottom of the stairs and I saw that my dog was sleeping there by the nightstand. And if he was there the entire time, then what the hell did my pet? So, I'm currently in the hospital with my grandma. She isn't doing so well, so I decided that I'd stay the night in case things took a turn for the worse. I went outside to smoke a cancer stick and just to get some fresh air, and I had to walk the mandatory 300 feet or so from the entrance, so I was decently far from the front entrance, off into a small gravel parking lot that was well lit for once. So, no cliche, the area was dimly lit. And smoke some good old cancer until I just hear a soft, "Hey," come from behind what was one of those dumpsters that are in one of their own enclosures with a locking gate. Being used to people saying weird things at this hour, 3 a.m., I just said, "Sup," while not looking in the direction of the sound, and then I hear the same, "Hey," again, but in the exact same tone, and I assume that it's just some dude having a laugh at my expense, so I just ignore it while I puff away, but again, this thing just said, "Hey," and again to me. Much to my annoyance, I turned around and I said, "Listen, buddy," and before I could continue, I saw a scraggly-looking coyote just staring at me, and then it just scampered off once I made eye contact. I was taken back, but since I thought it was just some animal that happened to pass by, I went to investigate this mystery man since I felt safe to do so, with the hospital being within shouting distance. But the thing that made me share this here is that even to get anywhere in this parking lot, you have to cross really crunchy and loud gravel, and all I saw was that dog thing scampering away, and there was nobody around. So this happened just last week, and some events leading up to it came from my housemates' accounts of what they saw, heard, or felt. It started with housemate T, who was the first person to report something. Out of all the people in the house too, I'm the only one who really believes or gives much merit to the supernatural. But recently, something happened that spooked my other two housemates pretty badly. So one night, while T was in bed, I don't know what time it was as he didn't mention it, he swore that he saw the lamp on his dresser move. He even went as far as to tell my other roommate Kay, about this. Kay brushes it off and says that it's probably nothing, he just imagined it in the dark or something. Admittedly, it's not much, but I feel like it was the first step in what was about to come. A few nights later, I'm asleep with my dog and suddenly I just wake up. My dog isn't reacting, and I honestly wasn't sure that she was awake at that moment, but I opened my eyes and glanced down my bed. And about 2.5, maybe 3 feet away from me, there was this dark shape. It didn't look human though, like a shadow person. It looked very inhuman. It was a shadow, but it seemed like it was craggy and very black. I only saw it for about 2 seconds before my bedroom door just burst open. I literally yelled, "What the hell?" only to see my housemate Kay standing at my door, asking if I was okay. I told her, yeah, I was asleep. I didn't even think to mention what I had just seen. But she told me that she heard what sounded like somebody retching or throwing up from her room. She didn't just hear it once either. Kay said that the first time that she heard it, it woke her up and she wasn't entirely sure that she actually did hear it. Kay decided, since she'd woke up to use the bathroom and apparently while she was in there, she heard the noise again, clear as anything, which is why she came to check on me. She thought that maybe I was really sick or something, but I told her that I was fine, it wasn't me, and I knew it wasn't my dog because I've heard her get sick in the middle of the night, and I always wake up when it happens. It's a very distinct noise. And at this point, my dog is definitely awake, but not acting strange or anything. She never does when stuff like this happens, though. So in the end, Kay accepts what I say and goes back to bed. And as I'm laying on my bed in the dark, I just have this really unsettled feeling. But I manage to get back to sleep, and I don't think too much of it the rest of the day. About a day or two later, though, I'm in the kitchen getting myself a drink or something, and Kay and I are alone in the house, when all of a sudden, Kay calls me from the other side of the house, and I go over to see what she needs. I get to her room, and she tells me that she feels like she needs me to see this, otherwise I wouldn't believe her. I give her a quizzical look and follow her into her room, and a porcelain doll that I'd gifted her about 3 years ago had fallen about 3 feet away from its place on top of a curio that Kay has in her room with her other 4 or so porcelain dolls, all of which haven't moved an inch. She gives me this wide-eyed look and says that she was in the shower and nowhere near the doll. She didn't even hear it fall, but when she came out, her shower is connected to her bedroom. The doll was on the floor. Nothing had bumped it too, and the doll hadn't recently moved or anything, and because it just sits there in that position where its legs are folded under it, the doll itself should be pretty stable. She was obviously pretty spooked, and I took the opportunity to explain what I thought that I saw the other night before she came into my room. It felt unsafe to be talking about it though in the house, and Kay insisted that we just leave for a little while and just get out. Once we were in the car and driving away, it felt okay to talk about it, and I mentioned to Kay that feeling of hesitance that I had at saying anything about it in the house, and Kay said that she felt the same, scared to talk about it while we were in there. We got home after about, I think it was about 2 hours of staying out and away. We saged the whole place together, and since then nothing else has really happened. I don't know why, but it just seems like we just randomly get these paranormal encounters every few months, especially if I haven't saged in a while. Mind you, the house isn't built on a site where anyone died, and the house isn't itself super old, and none of us are actively into the occult or anything, so I'm not entirely sure why this stuff even happened. The thing that spooks me the most, though, is that whatever was in the house seemed genuinely frightening, and it definitely spooked my very non-believer housemates into feeling like something unexplainable was happening. Most of the time, the crap that I experience isn't super scary or disturbing, just kind of mildly weird, and at least on one occasion an entity that visited was just cute and mischievous, I suppose. I'm not sure what's in that house though, and I wonder if anyone else has experienced seeing something like what I saw that night. If you guys have any answers, I would really appreciate hearing your theories and experiences. Thanks. This is a bit different than a lot of the others, as A, this is currently ongoing, and B, I'm not entirely certain. It could be nothing, but it really could be something too. I'm not too sure. Anyway, I've recently moved into an apartment in the historic part of a medium-ish sized town. The atmosphere is great, everyone seems friendly, and I get to walk twice a day for about an hour. Even the dogs, which feel like they have to bark at me, are pretty friendly, I suppose. The only fly in the ointment, though, is this guy who lives a little ways down from me, who may be a bit too friendly. So not long after I moved in, I started doing my walks and would notice this older man sitting out on the porch some evenings. I'd nod at him, he'd nod at me, or we might exchange greetings. You know, just normal neighbor stuff. A few weeks into this routine, I'm walking back to my apartment and passing his house. He's out there again as usual, but this time he calls out to me, stating how he always sees me walking. I respond that, yeah, I do it twice a day, and he invites me to come up and sit on his porch and just talk. Now, my mum might have raised me to be polite, but she didn't raise a fool either, so I politely declined and continued the short conversation from the grass in the front of his house. After a few minutes, I excused myself and I walked back to my apartment. The next few days went on as routine until one evening he's sitting on his porch, listening to somebody play electric guitar on his radio. I mean some really psychedelic stuff too, and he calls out to me. I stop and he asks if I like the music. I said yes. In truth, it wasn't really my thing, but again, I just wanted to be polite. And so he invites me to come and sit up on his porch and listen to it. I again decline, stating that I had somewhere to be, and he grouses jokingly that I need to stop making excuses. I again take my leave though, feeling a little bit more unnerved than the previous. Several more weeks pass though, and I'm walking by his house when he suddenly bellows, "Boy," at me from his porch. I stop and turn to face him. I have a thing about people being too familiar with me. I hate being called Bud and Buddy, so automatically I'm on edge. He asks why he hasn't seen me in the last few days, and I explain that I've been walking at the same time every evening, and again he invites me to come up and sit on his porch, and again I decline. After several days of walking, I'm out one morning a couple of days ago, doing my normal rounds when I pass this guy in sunglasses and a hat mowing his lawn. I squeeze past him, and the guy turns and demands to know why I didn't even stop to say hi. Surprise, surprise, it's my buddy. I state rightly that I didn't recognize him, and he suddenly just changes the subject, asking what I do. I tell him that I'm a writer. It's really more of a passion though than just a simple job, but it was the best answer that I had at the time. He says that he's wrote before, but probably never something as creative as I've done, which is mildly creepy considering that I never told him that I wrote fiction. He then says that he wants to read some of my writing and says to bring it up to his porch one day, before helpfully tacking on that if he's not there I should just knock because he's probably in the basement, where apparently his office is. Pretty creeped out by the fact that this dude is ticking all the red flags. I just continue on my walk. Several hours later though, in the evening, I'm walking by his house when I see him come out with his back to me. He hadn't seen me yet and fiddle with something on his porch. I slow down because I'm curious and because somewhere in my brain I guess I decided that it would be rude to not say hi. And he turns around after setting up the speaker again, telling me to come and sit down and listen to the music. Now, I was meeting some friends a few minutes later, and thus I declined, citing the fact that they were waiting on me. He immediately, half-jokingly, accuses me of lying and says that I won't get anywhere in life by not telling the truth, before then inviting that I hadn't had anything to do all day. I argue that, yes, actually, I did, and he finally drops the subject and lets me go. I'm walking away from him, and that was when I heard it. His screen door swinging shut. This meant that the man had got out on his porch and set up the music just to try to get me to come up there with him. That was the last time that I went that way after that, the next morning changing my pattern entirely to just avoid his house. And this is where I need the advice portion of the evening comes in. In your people's humble opinions, do you think I'm just blowing this out of proportion? Is this just some lonely retired old man reaching out to the one person that he sees on a regular basis? Or is this somebody with a much darker agenda trying to get me into a position where I'm easier to stab or incapacitate and be dragged back into his house or something? What do you guys think? So I was hunting by myself on this particular morning in some woods that I'd been to many times. I pulled into the park and my spot facing away from the woods. It was about 5:30 in the morning and pitch black, about half an hour before daylight, I think. As I was getting my gear together from the back seat of my truck and with my back to the woods, I could hear something walking the woodline really slowly. I decided to stop and listen and see if I could figure out where it was and what it was. But the problem was that when I stopped moving, so did it. So I went back to loading my rifle. This happened twice more. I was obviously a little nervous about going into the woods at this point because I didn't know what or where this thing was, but I had a rifle and a revolver on my hip, so I figured that I should be fine. I walked a few feet into the tree line and looked around and nothing was there. So I made the 5-minute slow walk into the pitch black with no flashlight. As I arrived, I found a big tree and leaned my rifle and backpack against it. I popped up my hunting blind, and as I went over to put the first stake in the ground, something, sounding as if it was just standing directly over top of me, made a snarling growl so deep that it almost vibrated me. And then, this growling grew into a high-pitched scream like a woman. My hair stood on end as I stood up and I turned around with my hand on my revolver, ready to fire at any sound or movement, but when I did, nothing was there. I stood there for a minute, looking into the darkness, trying to make sense of any of this. I figured at this point that it can see me, but I can't see it. It followed me, and if I leave, it may see it as a sign of weakness or retreat and even attack me. So I grabbed my stuff and I sat, waiting for daylight, and didn't hear or see anything else. Now, people have tried to tell me before that it was a dog, a coyote, or a bear. The problem is that I'm 6'2", even bent over I'm at least 4 foot, and I'm definitely no small guy, and this was towering right over top of me. Plus, when I stood up, I never heard anything move. No leaves, no sticks. There weren't any big trees close by too. Plus, it was smart enough to stop and watch me when I turned around, so I couldn't triangulate where it was, and then even walk around me to come from behind. Someone I know who had a similar story seems to think that it's Indian spirits or something. The area where I live has a lot of Indian history and hieroglyphs all over the area, so that is true, but as for spirits and ghosts, I'm not so sure about that. When I was around 6 years old, my brother and I went to this creepy daycare center in a huge old Victorian house. This was during the late 1980s when stories of child abduction and satanic cults were pretty rampant in the culture and the news. We went to the kindergarten half days because our mother would drop us off and we'd get the bus to and back from school. Our mother would pick us up after she got off work at the local hospital. There was a big playground out back that was fenced off. After getting out of school, the kids from the center would always play out the back. And at some point, this really strange guy, maybe 20-ish, started coming around and talking to the kids through the fence. He acted weird and spoke in a really funny voice. Not sure if he was actually retarded or just pretending to be, but he would flash his privates at some of the kids and ask them to flash back. Luckily, I only saw this once and I just noped the hell out of there. He creeped most of us out though, and I know we tried to stay away from him. For whatever reason, though, the fat grumpy slobs that worked at the daycare never seemed to be around when this creep would show up or believe us when we talked about it. It was a state-run daycare, though, so no surprises there. One day after school, though, getting off the bus, we and another kid took a shortcut from the bus stop to the daycare, basically just cutting behind some tall bushes on the side of the building to the door. Not really a shortcut, but hey, as little boys, we thought it was cool to travel through the hedge tunnel. But my brother was in the front, and I was in the middle, and a third kid was behind us. And then we heard it. A rustling in the bushes and loud shouting. The person said, "I'm gonna get you." And whipping around, I saw the same creepy guy standing behind us. He started laughing hysterically and grabbed the kid behind us, who immediately started screaming and kicking at him. My brother and I turned around and grabbed our friend by the arms and started pulling him away, sort of playing tug-of-war with this kid. All the while, this guy is slobbering and talking about the things that he wants to do to us. We must have made a racket too, because eventually the guy let go and he took off. We ran inside crying and tried to explain to the daycare ladies, who were just angry at us and said that we were lying or that the guy was only joking. I remember our mother being mad that evening too and yelling at us about taking shortcuts. I don't really remember anything after that. I don't think anyone called the police or we ever saw the dude again, but regardless, it was a pretty scary experience at the time. Kinda hard to share all this because it brings back some pretty bad memories, but I hope that it was of interest. So, I don't tend to believe in the paranormal much. I tend to believe that there's a logical explanation for just about everything. This is due to the fact that I grew up in a very small Catholic village in Portugal where people believe in witchcraft, curses, ghosts, evil spirits. They highly exaggerate their encounters and flat out lie about meeting horrendous monsters in the night or flying women in the skies, stuff like that. I don't complain though, because I absolutely love horror stories and always encourage them to tell me about them, even though I don't believe it. Many of my close friends too have told me a couple of, I guess, believable ones, which makes me sometimes open-minded to it. Most of these stories though revolve around a very old house that belonged to a wealthy family back in the 50s. They were very involved with the country's politics and ended up fleeing to Brazil, leaving the house abandoned. The house is huge and still fully furnished. Lots of paintings, old desks and beds. We've even found old photos and letters in there. Unfortunately, kids have destroyed a lot of the stuff and painted the walls with dick drawings and bad words because, edgy kids, right? I've only ever been in it during the day and haven't ever seen anything unusual. But my friends swear that during the night, it's just a very different house. One night though, we decided to go in. Some of my friends stayed outside, refusing to be a part of the adventure, so only 3 of us entered. With a flashlight on our phones, we climbed in through the broken window. Already the vibe is pretty different. It's weird too how something changes so much during the night. Everything just seems so sinister. The window we entered through though takes us to the 2nd floor. We go up to the 3rd floor, then 4th, and all the way down to the 1st floor. And this is where it begins to get really weird. Like I said, we grew up in a place where witches are real. A lot of older ladies consider themselves to be real witches. They practice a lot of witchcraft, mostly in parks. They'll leave candy and teddies just lying on a blanket with some random pages with spells, or sometimes it'll be with a glass of red wine. This is to apparently lure in kids or teens, and if they take it, they're now cursed. A lot of crap like this happens, and we've all seen it at least once around the village. I don't believe it works or anything, but it is scary to think that some people just wish harm on others like that. But anyway, it's on the 1st floor that we find a blanket. It's full of candles, a book of dark magic and the occult with some of the pages spread around. But the disgusting part was that right in the middle was a hat, and inside the hat were hair cuttings and teeth. There is also just a really horrible smell, and after investigating, we discovered that it came from a cat's head that was placed behind the hat. It was at this point that I just want to leave, because whoever left this is obviously an evil bitch and I do not want to run into her. All 3 of us are obviously scared. This all seemed like a bit too much. My friend picked up one of the pages on the floor though, curious as to what was written on it, and she started shaking quite violently, and when I touched her back, she just collapsed on the floor and started to convulse. We were terrified, and my friend told me to run outside and call for help. I did, and I've never run so fast in my life. As I ran back up the stairs to the second floor though, I heard as clear as day somebody running right behind me. I assumed it was my friend following. As I climbed out the window, my face towards the corridor that I just ran in from, I expected to see my friend following after me, but instead, I saw a woman peeking her head from behind the wall. I looked straight at her and she said really loudly, "You shouldn't be in other people's homes or we might start going into yours." And at that, I lost it. I screamed so loud that my other friends, they came to me. The boys went back in for my other two friends and we immediately called an ambulance. The police also showed up because we were technically trespassing private property. We didn't get into much trouble, just a bit of a warning and a phone call to our parents. We explained everything and I said that I'd seen a lady inside the house, but they said that they'd found nobody. My friend that had collapsed had to have a series of exams done to her, but in the end they found nothing wrong and she's not had any other attacks since then. This is the only true paranormal situation that's ever happened to me, and I was 17 and I'm now 23. It still really freaks me out to this day as well, and I've had some nightmares since then. I never went back to that house, and last year it was actually demolished. They're using the land to make parking spaces or something. And believe me, I have looked for logical answers to what happened that night, and I haven't found any. So, I'm not so sure that this is paranormal as much as just plain odd. I have to explain some background info real quick, so just stick with me here too. My husband, our son and I moved into this townhouse around February of this year. It's 3 stories, not counting the basement. The second floor has the master bedroom and then a very small office space type room. In this small room, there's a set of stairs that lead up to a third loft type bedroom, on the 3rd floor obviously. And we ended up splitting my son's room between the small bedroom and the 3rd floor. So the 3rd floor is more of a playroom, while his closet, dresser, etc. is in the small room. Now, he has had horrible night terrors since he was about 6 months old. He just turned 3, so he still sleeps with us most nights. His bed wouldn't fit in the small room, so it's actually on the 3rd floor. None of us really like this house as well. It's an okay property and all, but it just feels unwelcoming. I really don't know how else to describe it, but we just don't like it. It doesn't have an open floor plan and just feels kind of closed off and cold, I suppose. My husband works away during the week and is usually only home on weekends, so it's just me here alone with our son and our dog, our only pet aside from Fish. We've had him for about 7 years and he's very well behaved. And I get really uneasy here at night during the week and make my dog and son stick pretty close. Anyway, I've had a couple of small things happen, like hearing footsteps running around on the 3rd floor. But the townhouse to the left is empty and the right doesn't even have the 3rd floor like we do. It's a row of 4 townhouses. The 2 middle have a 3rd floor. Oh, and my son and dog are both terrified of the basement. Unfinished, washer and dryer are down there. But my dog just will not go down there. He's never once been in that basement as well, and when I do the laundry, he just stands at the top of the steps and waits for me. We've tried multiple times to make him go down after he rolled on a dead animal or got covered in mud and needed cleaning off. But not even treats are good enough, and we've even tried to carry him, but he just wiggled and threw himself around so much that even my husband couldn't safely carry him down there. He's 70 pounds. My son was speech delayed too. He went through speech therapy, which he has since graduated from, but his speech has just recently took off. Right after we moved in, I went down to the laundry and carried him with me, and as we got into the basement, he said, "Mama, what's that?" as he pointed around the ceiling of the room in a following something type motion. I asked him what he meant, and he said, "Those flying people." At the time, that was a pretty significant amount of talking for him. Usually, he would only say a word or maybe a 2-word phrase or something like that. It creeped me out, if I'm honest, and also, more recently, when he isn't having night terrors, he talks in his sleep like crazy, and at least once or twice a week he sits straight up and points to the ceiling or the corner of the room. Every single time, never the floor or the couch or anything, and says, "Mama, who is that?" or "Mummy, what is that?" He'll repeat the question just over and over and eventually start crying as I tell him that he's just dreaming and there's nothing there. I never see anything, but it's enough to scare the crap out of me, especially at night when we're alone. So basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that we've had a few creepy things happen, but it's nothing that can't be explained. Which leads me to the point of this story. In the small second-story part of my son's bedrooms, I keep his dirty clothes in a kind of cylindrical heavy cloth Batman hamper. Right after we moved in, I noticed that his clothes were always laying on the floor around it. I'd pick them up and throw them back in, but the next time I would go upstairs, they would be back on the floor. I didn't think too much about it, for the first couple of months anyway. It was just annoying. I thought my son was doing it at first, but he's really on the second floor without me. He's like my little shadow and just follows me everywhere. So I started taking notice of it more, and I would make a point to put the clothes back in there before we would leave the house to go somewhere, and even though nobody would be in the house while we were gone, the clothes would be out. So, at that point, I decided, okay, if this isn't my son, it's got to be my dog doing it. I checked the clothes to make sure that he wasn't chewing them or anything, but he never had any chew marks or slobber on them, and they were always just right outside the hamper. It wasn't like he was dragging them to his bed or kennel or anything. He always had access to the hamper at our old house, but this never happened there. Plus, I don't think I've ever actually seen him in my son's room. He always just hangs out on my bed, in his dog bed in the kitchen, outside, or in his kennel. But I mean, whatever, dogs do some weird stuff sometimes, right? So after that, I didn't pay much attention to it until recently when my husband brought it up to me. He started noticing it happening on his own as well, and even though he's only here on weekends, it was still prevalent enough for him to take notice. Last week he asked if I'd been the one digging through our son's hamper and leaving the clothes on the floor. I told him how it's been happening for a long time now, and I think it's the dog. So we decided to start closing our son's door when we aren't in there, just to see what happens. It's been a week now, and the first time it happened with the door closed, I figured maybe the dog had done it somehow before I closed the door, but it kept happening. Now, my husband took off work today for a doctor's appointment, and this evening we decided to go and do some grocery shopping. As we left, both my husband and I checked the bedroom, shut the door together, and left the house together so we couldn't blame the other for gaslighting or anything. We also locked the dog in the kitchen, just to be sure, and when we got back, we went upstairs, and I kid you not, all the clothes were torn out of the hamper, and the hamper was laid flat. And it honestly looked like a steamroller or something had run over everything. I can assure you too that that door was closed, and I know that there was nobody in the house, and there's no way that it was the dog. It's just weird, but I mean, what kind of ghost haunts something by making a mess of a hamper? It's just so random, and the door that we closed is the only way into that part of the house, and we don't have an attic or a crawl space. All of the extra space was made into the third floor bedroom, so it isn't like we have someone just living in the attic or anything. Our landlord told us a long time ago that the people that lived here before us were a young couple with a newborn, and they ended up moving because they bought their first house. So nothing weird there. The neighbors have said before too that they were a nice and just normal family. So there's nothing creepy that's happened on the property, unless it happened before they lived here or something. I really don't know, and I'm just clutching at straws because I'm pretty much stumped here. I feel like this is a glitch in the Matrix type thing or something. Anyway, if anybody has any reasonable explanations for this or ideas, I would love to hear it. This happened to me a few years ago. It was New Year's Eve, and I'd just been out in the city to celebrate with 3 of my closest girlfriends. At the end of the evening, when we were all exhausted and ready for bed, one of our friends travelled to her house near the club, while the others made the hour-long trek back to our home suburb. There were 3 of us together, all females. So, the trip to our suburb typically involved a 45-minute-long bus trip, and then an Uber or a taxi to our house. I have lived in the area my entire life and am very familiar with the most convenient way to get to and from my house. On this particular evening, we got off the bus and I booked an Uber with my phone. It was around 4 a.m, so you can imagine our remote town had very little road traffic at this time. A car pulls up at the bus stop, as this was the first car that we had seen arriving, and no one else was around except us, so we assumed that it was our ride and we got in. Our Uber driver was a Russian man with a very thick accent, although he didn't speak a lot. Immediately I noticed, though, that he was taking us in the wrong direction of my house, but I figured that it was fine. Sometimes GPSs take drivers on a different route, so I just brushed off the thought. But then, about 10 minutes later, I get a text message that my Uber driver is arriving at my pickup destination. I looked at the driver beside me, angry that I was too tired or intoxicated to remember the text message that you receive before your ride pulls up, but also terrified that I may have gotten my 2 best friends and myself into a vehicle with a man that we didn't know at all. My actual Uber driver then tried to call me, presumably to find out where we were, but I ignored the call, not wanting to alert the man who had actually picked us up. At that point, I still hadn't said anything to my best friends, but I asked the driver if he'll stop at a service station so I can grab a drink of water before we continue the journey, because I felt sick. He questioned me, "We aren't far from your destination now," but I insisted and he agreed. When we arrived at the service station, I asked my friends to get out with me, desperately, and they obliged. I explained the situation to them, and we all agreed to tell the driver that we were going to walk to a friend's house nearby and not to worry about the rest of the trip. He seemed frustrated and insisted that he take us, but we refused to get back in the car and eventually he left. And then we ended up getting a cab back home from there. It's taken me some time to figure out where to start this story, since there are so many starting places, and no end in sight, at least one I can see. So I've decided to start it at the moment that my life changed forever. Not the drastic change that would come later, but a change that began a terrifying journey that has yet to conclude. I'll start the story from when I saw it. A little bit of quick background though. I was born in the early 80s. My parents were youth pastors for a Pentecostal church in the southwest of the US. I had grown up in the Pentecostal church my whole life. Eventually my parents became pastors of their own church, in fact. The start of my story isn't the beginning, but it is the start. I'm going to tell it as I experienced it, so they'll be back and forth from one timeline to another, but I want you to take the same journey that I did. So, I was a preteen when I saw it. I'm not sure about the exact year, but I know that it was between 1995 and 97. It was summer. I was at a church camp, the same one that I'd gone to for most of my childhood. It was in the South US, in the hill country area. It was a pretty large camp, really spread out, and on any given summer, there would be roughly 1,000 campers, including adults who either were counselors, helpers, or those doing the church services. My parents were pretty active with the camp too. In fact, my dad was well known in the district. When people found out that I was his son, they were amazed, sometimes treated me different, like I was first kid or something. I hate saying this, but I would use this to my advantage sometimes and would get away with a lot of things, or go behind the scenes of the camp or any other church activity that others wouldn't. Anyway, my parents were there the summer that I saw it. I was a camper that year. The building where all the campers stayed at was on top of a hill in a large building. Had only been built just a few years prior. The camp was a lot older, but they had added new buildings and such. And after a huge fire at the old cafeteria, which I do have vague memories of, they built an entirely new cafeteria. The building was in 3 parts. The left side held the boys' dormitory and the right the girls'.
The middle was where the small little church sat, and this is where I saw it. The little church had like pink carpeted floors, off-pink walls, and cushioned chairs to match. The kids' preacher was a close friend of my dad, so I knew him pretty well, and vice versa. The stage in the front of the room, which was literally a step up from the floor, had a stained glass window in the back. And I will never forget this stained glass window for as long as I live, and you're about to find out why. It was a picture of a woman in biblical clothes pouring water from a clay jar in a flowing river. For what for, I have no idea. But next to her was a small lamb. They stood on a grassy hill with a tree to the left, I believe, and a greying sky. I had seen it many times before, and I admired it greatly. It was a beautiful piece of work. The room was packed full of kids, all of us ranging from ages 12 to 15, both boys and girls. The boys sat on the left side and girls on the right. There were at least 40 to 50 kids inside here too. Each of us had itineraries, so while we were in the service for an hour, other campers may be doing recreational activities or swimming or any number of things. My bunk, which consisted of about 5 or 6 boys, I think, most of whom were from my church. Being who I was, I usually got to pick who I wanted to bunk with, another perk of being my dad's son. But as the service began, my attention span started wavering. I mean, I had heard all this religious stuff before from my dad and others. I began looking around, and eventually my eyes wandered over to that stained glass window, and that was when I saw it. It had never been there before, at least not that I had seen. In the lower right-hand corner, near the red stained glass border, was a face. But not just any face, a terrifying face. Aside from everything else on the stained glass window, it looked absolutely real too. Like it was peering through the glass, but that was impossible because behind it was a small area which held lights to backlight it, and there was basically no room for anyone big or small back there. Its skin was fleshly coloured, nothing out of the ordinary, but what really grabbed my attention wasn't its open mouth with what looked like sharp pointy teeth, but its eyes. The eyes were large, bulging out of the sockets. Those eyes have haunted me to this day, and on its forehead were 2 small bumps, like a pair of horns almost, that didn't quite come in yet. It was scary, but I was more fascinated that I'd never noticed it before. I leaned over to one of my friends sitting next to me and asked if he had ever noticed that face in the stained glass window. He looked, but he told me that he couldn't see anything. Confused, I asked another friend who replied with the same answer. It was then that I began wondering if what I was seeing was some sort of optical illusion or something, but why couldn't anyone else see it? The whole time that we were in there too, I just couldn't take my eyes off of it. And when I tried, I felt like it was just staring at me. As we were leaving the room, I walked to the other side to the area the girl sat, and I looked, and there it was, as it was before, this demonic face. In fact, no matter where I was in the room, the face was there. I pushed it to the side, and I spent the rest of the day not thinking about it, until the next day when we went back to the church, and it was still there, same position, same terrifying face, and no one could see it but me. This is when I started getting really scared, and later that day I had tracked my dad down and I asked if I could speak to him in private. We had gone into my parents' cabin. My mother was off somewhere in the camp doing God only knows what, but I asked my dad if he knew anything about the stained glass window in the little church. He told me that he knew enough, and even knew the guy who had made it, and that it cost the district quite a pretty penny. I asked him if there was a demonic face in it, to which he replied, not that he could remember. He asked me why, and I told him that I just kept seeing this face and nobody else could. My dad then got onto his knees, put his hands on my shoulders, and told me not to tell anyone about what I was seeing. I tried to protest, but what I had taken as anger back then was actually fear. What kind of fear? I wouldn't learn till much later. Like I said, I thought that it was anger that a man of my dad's status had a son who was seeing demons in the Pentecostal religion. It wouldn't be perceived well. So, I never mentioned it again to my dad or anyone else, but every single day I saw it. The whole week, in fact, its bulging eyes just looking at me. I didn't know it at the time, but seeing this demonic face was just the start of what was to come. It was the beginning of my journey, but not my parents' journey. So after camp, we had gotten back home, and my parents had hired some youth pastors from out of state, a husband and a wife with 3 kids, 2 girls, and the youngest one a boy. I don't remember too much about the whole family, just a few snippets here and there. I do, however, remember the young boy, only because he didn't look right. Aside from looking like a typical 6-year-old, he was just always pale with dark circles around his eyes, like he was a ghost almost. Which I'm not saying that he was, because obviously he wasn't. But on top of that, the boy was just always sick. Something was just always wrong with him. For the first few months of them being our youth pastors, they had moved into our house temporarily until they could find their own home. They lived in my bedroom, which was upstairs and to the right. I was put in the second living room downstairs, which actually had a TV and a very comfortable sectional couch. The mother actually homeschooled her kids, but never at home. She always took them someplace else. I believe that it was a park or something. Anyway, so while my dad and the youth pastor were at the church doing their godly work, and my brother and I were at school, my mother had the house to herself. She would tell me too that she would hear things in the house, and it always came from my bedroom. There were times that she would hear someone stomping in my room, or she would hear voices, or something sounded like it had fallen. But each time that she would investigate, there would be nothing there. In fact, this happened just about every time my mother was home alone, and it had never happened until these people had come and stayed with us. Eventually, they would get a house of their own, but things didn't really change in the house, paranormal-wise that is. My mother would still hear things coming from my bedroom. There was one incident too where my Meemaw, my mother's mum or grandma, had come to stay with us for a week, and her and my mother saw what looked like someone standing outside the window in my parents' bedroom. They had even called the police, and nothing was really found, except for footprints found outside the window. We had lived in a nice neighborhood at the time, but the cops had told my mother that, nice or not, there were always peeping Toms. And the only thing that I personally experienced in that house was when I had been sleeping in the downstairs living room, while the youth pastors lived with us and I was watching TV in my parents' room. I even remembered what movie I was watching because, like the demonic face, this has haunted me ever since. I was watching Batman Forever, which at that age was my favorite movie, and I had watched it hundreds of times, I'm sure. I had been sitting on the floor, leaned up against my parents' large bed. It was night time. The bedroom light was off to give it more of a theatre experience, which I do to this day, I must say. I had both of my hands on the ground. My left hand was somewhat under the bed. I was immersed in the film when, all of a sudden, I felt a hand touch my hand that was under the bed. I knew it was a hand too because I could feel the flesh of it. I bolted up and I just ran into the living room where my parents were, terrified, and I told them. My mother became worried, but my father held his position as a strong man of God and went to investigate. He looked under the bed, checked the closets, the adjoining bathroom, and, as usual, found nothing. To make a long story short, after a few months after they had moved out of our house, my dad had gone to church one Sunday morning. He would always go around 4 a.m. to pray, set up his sermon, stuff like that. And when he got into the parking lot, he had seen the youth pastor's car was in the big empty parking space, as well as another car, one that he recognized but wasn't sure whose it was exactly. When he entered the church, he comes to find out that the youth pastor was with a member of the youth group in his office, having an affair. So, eventually, my father had to fire him, which caused quite a conflict with people in the church, especially the ones who supported the youth pastor, who happened to be related to the girl that he was having an affair with. Yeah, it was very messy. But one woman in particular, though, who I'll call Karen, a Hispanic woman who had grown up in Mexico. Where we had lived, it wasn't too far from, just a few miles from the border, in fact. But there is a reason that I told you a part of this story, because it has a lot to do with the next part. So after the youth pastor and his family were let go, our church, which had a little over 100 people, had begun a revival. My dad called an evangelist friend of his, I'll call him Bob. Bob was married with 2 children, both boys, roughly younger than me, and were more close to my brother's age, I suppose. Bob had begun the revival, which became quite huge, in fact. I should let you know too that I'm no longer a Christian, nor do I believe in the Christian religion, and you'll soon find out why. Anyway, this revival became really big, like I said. Our church was filled to the capacity, and people were speaking in tongues and being slain in the spirit and all that stuff. It had lasted 13 weeks, which, now that I think about it, is quite an interesting number, considering things. Karen, who was close to the youth pastor my dad had let go, was giving my parents the cold shoulder and started becoming close with the evangelist Bob and his family. Now one day, during this revival, my mother, whom I'm very close with, told me something that I would never forget. She told me that a woman had come to my father telling him that her daughter was being possessed by a demon and that my dad had to perform an exorcism to no avail. My dad didn't want me to know this, but my mother told me anyways and told me to keep it a secret and not to tell my dad that I knew, or even my brother. One night at revival, as people started showing up and getting ready for service, my mother pointed out the demon-possessed woman to me. She seemed normal, pretty even, and nothing creepy about her in the least. My mother, being the good pastor's wife that she was, always welcomed her, hugging them, talking to them and whatnot. I watched as my mother went over to the demon-possessed woman and welcomed her and then hugged her, and as soon as she did, my mother pulled away as the woman started shaking violently. With a panicked look on my mother's face, she walked over to my father, whispered something in his ear. My dad looked over at the demon-possessed woman. My mother came over to me and told me to get the children rounded up and take them into the dining quarters as she and others cleared out the sanctuary. Once everyone was out, the doors were shut behind. My dad and a few of the board members were behind the closed doors dealing with the demon-possessed woman. It wouldn't be until years later, too, that I found out what had happened behind those closed doors, and it still haunts my father. So, according to what my father told me, he and the board members began praying over the woman who was shaking violently and spouting out obscenities. The janitor lady, Carolyn, was in there as well, and for what reason I have no idea. But the woman began screaming as if she was in pain. My father continued to pray for her, and not too long after that, the woman began to gag, and at this point, the janitor lady ran to grab a bucket and brought it over, to which the woman vomited into it. My father said too that what came out of her mouth was not normal looking. He said that it was like a blackish blob. His first thought too was to take it somewhere to get it analysed, but unfortunately, Carolyn flushed it down the toilet before he could do anything. But what scared my father the most was the fact that this woman was still possessed and told my dad in a dark voice, "We'll meet again." My father doesn't really like talking about this, and I've only heard this story a few times, and when I bring it up, my dad pretty much closes it down straight away. There's a part of me that thinks there's much more to this story, but he won't say, and the reason is that Carolyn never came back to the church. In fact, one day, not too long after, my dad and I had gone to see a movie. Afterwards, my dad wanted to actually go and stop by Carolyn's place to check on her and find out why she hadn't returned. And when she answered the door, she had a cigarette in her mouth, which honestly shocked me at the time. She wouldn't let us in, but she told my dad something along the lines of, "Pastor, what I saw that night shook my faith." And after that, we just never saw her again. And now back to where the demon-possessed girl told my dad that they'd meet again. According to my dad, and even my grandparents have confirmed this story, when he was a young boy in the late 60s, my dad had awoken in the middle of the night and saw a shadow person in his room. As my dad stared at it in horror, he said that it just got bigger and bigger until its head was touching the ceiling. Eventually, my dad found his voice and screamed for my grandparents. That's all I pretty much know about that, except for one more event, an almost unbelievable event if I'm being honest. As I stated before, I was born in the early 80s, and not too long after I was born was when my parents were youth pastors at the church in the southwest US, and on a Wednesday night at church, with around 50 to 80 people in the sanctuary, a group of strange people just entered the church. My mother said that there was about 10 or 15, I think, of these people, some of whom were dressed in black leather with spikes, typical 80s punk stuff, while others wore white shirts with anti-Christian messages written in black ink. They had gone to the front of the church during the service and started disrupting it, saying obscenities against Christ and Christians. The pastor and the board members, who my dad was one as well, took all the people outside the church while somebody called the police, who were on their way. Now, the leader of this group had actually started talking to my dad. The leader was younger than my dad. The leader said that he knew my dad and hadn't seen him in a long time. My dad asked what he meant, to which the leader said something along the lines of, "I was in your bedroom that night." To further prove this, he began telling my dad that he knew a lot about him, like where he was born, who my grandparents were, his social security number, who his best friend growing up was, his favorite teacher, his first car, where he went to college, just everything. Then the leader gave the same information about my mother. Then, scarily enough, he even mentioned my name, my security number, where I was born, and that I was his, marked and watched. Just writing this out still gives me chills just considering it. I mean, even if it wasn't a paranormal situation, the fact that these weird people came into our church and knew all this stuff about us, and were so aggressive, it's weird to say the least. I had first heard this story when I was about 16 or so, and I remember one time at camp, the same one where I saw the demon, where me and my friends, who were too young to actually be campers, were heading up to our cabins at the top of the hill, while our parents were doing church camp stuff. It was nighttime, and on our way up the hill, we encountered a man who just kind of came out of nowhere. He was dressed like a biker, leather and spikes. I don't really remember that much too, except that the three of us friends just got scared and we just ran down the hill where we ran into one of the mothers who told us to get in the van. She looked around with a flashlight as we drove up the hill, but we couldn't see anything. I've always wondered too if this man had something to do with those people many years before who interrupted that church service and said that I was theirs. So now back to the revival. So after the incident with the demon-possessed girl, things got back to normal, in a sense I suppose. On the 13th week of the revival though, Bob had approached my father and told him that God had told him to build another church, and so he did. Except, he took a lot of members from our church, which really did hurt our church a lot. But we had roughly 200 members, now down to less than 50, and one of the people who left with Bob was Karen. Karen had come up to my mother and told her that she and her family weren't happy with how things had gone down with the youth pastor. She told my mother that she had come from some dark places in Mexico and that she gave my family the evil eye, which my mother had no idea what that was. And this next part really does devastate me, and just thinking about it honestly brings me to tears. But first I'm going to tell you how I experienced it, followed by what my parents saw, which they wouldn't tell me until I was an adult, and with good reason I might add. So it was a Sunday morning. My mother had awoken me to get ready for church. I got up off of my bed, sleepily, and began to get dressed when I noticed that my dog Pepper had done a crap on the floor. But Pepper was my dog. She loved me, and when I left for school, she would sit at the window and just wait for me, wouldn't even eat until I got home. So panicked, because my mother would get very upset when Pepper would use the restroom on our carpet, I ran into the adjoining bathroom and I grabbed a white towel. I would do the laundry later, but my mother would never find out. I ran over to the spot and noticed that it was actually diarrhea, which was gross and even worse. I put the towel on top and I began to wipe it all up, and that was when I noticed that it wasn't actually diarrhea. It was a big pool of blood. I looked over at Pepper. She was laying next to my bed, and I figured that she was just sick. So at this point, I ran and I told my mum. I thought that she would still be upset, but I saw a terror and just a worry in my mum's face that I'd never seen before. She told me, though, to put Pepper outside with food and water, and we would let her back in once we got back from church. Once church ended and we got back home, I ran out of the car to the backyard. And no joke when I say that I'm still hurt by this and I'm crying. I found my dog lying on her side near the house. I called out to her, and nothing. I called out again, and nothing again. I figured at the time that she was in a deep sleep, so I walked over and put my hand on her to let her know that I was home, and that's when I felt that she was just as stiff as a board. Tears welling in my eyes, I backed away slowly and then ran inside the house to tell my parents. Strangely too, when I saw them, my mother had tears in her eyes and was really scared, and my dad's face was blank. I told them about Pepper, and that afternoon before church, we took Pepper's tiny body and buried her out in the churchyard, far away from the church itself. It was really hard watching my dad dig that hole and place Pepper in there, now wrapped in a black trash bag, into the ground. And after this, I would descend into some pretty deep depression. Like I said, it wasn't until I was 18 or 19, though, that my parents told me the truth. You see, when we got home from church that dreadful Sunday afternoon, as I ran to the backyard, my parents found the front door slightly open. Upon going inside, my parents were startled to find every picture that my mother had hanging on the walls upside down, also with pictures on tables and all face down. On the kitchen counter, too, was a long, thick strand of hair, which my dad had analysed at the nearby police station and came to find out that it was actually a horsehair, which meant that someone had broken into our house and, even worse, that someone had poisoned my dog. My mother said that Karen had threatened my parents with witchcraft a few days before this, saying that my parents would regret what they had done to the youth pastors. To this day, I really don't understand why the youth pastors were so important to Karen. All I know is that that bitch had something to do with murdering my dog and breaking into my house. Upon further investigation, too, I found out that our family was cursed, and literally, ever since then, my family has been through just hell. I've never seen the demon face again, but I've definitely had many paranormal incidences, most of which I can't find any relation to, but I don't think that this thing has left me alone. My husband, and yes, I'm gay, has seen shadows ever since we got together as well. But my husband is actually an atheist and doesn't believe in anything paranormal, but sometimes I think that even he thinks that there's something weird going on. I feel like I'm just being watched, and sometimes I even hear someone call out my name. For instance, one time I was at work and I heard someone call my name, and I walked around the store asking co-workers if they called to me, which they all said no. So, thinking that it was just in my head, I'd gone back to where I had heard it, and my co-worker there asked who called my name, which means that she had heard it too. So much has happened in my life, the things I can't even begin to put into writing. I know without a shadow of a doubt that whatever I saw is still haunting me in some form or fashion. Not a day goes by, in fact, that I don't think about that face. Not a day goes by where I don't think about all of this. I don't trust a lot of people, and I don't know if those people have followed me, because some incidences make me think that it may be possible. I can tell you, though, that I do live in fear. I don't know how to deal with a lot of this, and my husband, who doesn't think that I'm lying, thinks a lot of this is just in my head on top of coincidence. And honestly, I can see why people would think that. But trust me when I say that this isn't a story that is easy to put into words. It's more something that you just have to experience to understand it. There's just so much more to tell as well, and so much that I could say on this topic, but for now, I think that this will be enough. If anyone has any idea of how to fix all this or knows something, any help would be greatly appreciated. Whatever this thing is, whether it's in my head or just paranormal, it's still haunting me and my family too, and this curse or whatever it is, it's getting worse. I'm not lying too when I say that I'm beyond scared. Just recently, about 5 months ago, my family moved into the house we're in right now after doing renovations on it for like 2 to 3 years straight. The house is in a low middle class neighborhood and needed a lot of work. After finally finishing it, we moved in ASAP and we got settled. It's very cozy and the neighbors are super nice too, so that's good. However, After about a week or two of just being in the house, at about 5 in the morning I woke up and decided to get a glass of water before getting ready for school. And to my surprise, I looked out of the kitchen window into the front yard and saw a man walking back and forth under the streetlight. Creepy as hell, yeah, but after only a few seconds of watching him, he looked up and continued down the road. I didn't think much of it at this point. It may have been just someone walking home or another location, so I dropped it, didn't tell my parents or friends pretty much anything. Fast forward to the end of June, I woke up at about 3 in the morning, I think it was, to my dogs going absolutely ballistic. I scrambled to get them to calm down since I didn't want my dad or mum waking up and getting mad about it. However, I looked out the window and noticed the same dude just standing there under the streetlight, staring at or into our house. This unnerved me greatly, and I turned the lights on, and almost immediately the dude walked away. My dogs finally chilled out, and I woke my dad up and I told him about it this time. My dad didn't seem to really worry too much about it, and told me to tell him if I saw him again. I agreed to this, and I just went back to bed. About a week ago, I was unloading a storage unit pod in our backyard. I was home alone and it was rather late. I wanted to retrieve my guitar case before I lent my guitar to my friend. My dog started barking like crazy again, and I immediately went to check out what they were barking at. And lo and behold, there that dude was again, in the same spot, staring at or into our house again. Now, I had 3 choices at this point. Call the cops, call my dad, or be a tough guy. And my dumbass chose option C. I grabbed a baseball bat from my room and I just walked outside. And the moment that I opened the door, he began to walk away. I screamed at him, "Hey, get back here!" And in response, he just ran. But once my folks got home, I got a major earful, and rightly so, I suppose. But my dad and mum called the cops, and the cops did the best that they could with what little that we had. They simply told us to call again if anything else happened, and then they went their way. But last night, though, I was getting home with my dad, mum, and sister after a night with some family friends, and as we pulled up to our driveway, there he was. But this time, he was in our yard. The moment that the headlights shined on him, he ran down the road. My dad cursed, parked the car, got out with his gun, and stared at the guy as he just ran away. My sister, mum, and I went inside immediately to call the cops. We don't know what happened after we went inside, but according to my dad, the man turned around and stared back at him for a while, before just running off again. I don't know if this guy will be back and how long he's been doing this for. I really hope that nothing spirals out of control, but I'm not so sure that this is over yet. I'm a girl, and my mum was a horrible addict. She barely took care of me as a kid, in fact. And at the time of this incident, I was around 6 or 7 or so my awareness and understanding of things happening may not totally make much sense. But this also happened in the 90s. So one night, my mother and I were on a car ride. I wasn't sure why we were driving, but it was late at night. I'm not sure what time it was, but I assume it was really late because there weren't many cars on the street and I was sleeping in the back seat. I don't even remember getting in the car, but my mum drove up to some sketchy house and left me in the car for what felt like forever. And suddenly, the car door swung open and someone violently grabbed me by my arm, yanked me out of it. I started screaming and crying until the man that grabbed me looked me in the eyes and said, "Be quiet and don't try to run or I'll kill you." He had a scruffy beard and looked like, honestly, a madman. I was scared to death, so I just listened. Then he held me tight by my arm, shut the car door, and walked with me down the street. I looked back at the house that my mum was in, hoping that my mum would come out at the last second and save me. I looked at the house as long as I could as the man dragged me further and further away. As we walked down the street, I wanted to cry, but I was in shock and in fear. I didn't know what to do. If I sniffed or cried, the man would just tighten his grip and yell at me. I can't even explain just how scared and confused I was. We walked for a little while and ended up in the projects. The projects were a bunch of buildings crammed together in a really crappy neighborhood. We walked into one of the buildings and walked up a flight of stairs. My legs and feet hurt like hell, but I was too scared to stop moving or complain. We walked up another flight of stairs when I saw some random guy smoking a cigarette in the stairway. Then, without warning, the guy that kidnapped me just fell to the ground. I didn't know how the kidnapper fell to the ground so fast, but the next thing that I remember is the cigarette guy just punching and kicking the kidnapper in his head and face. The kidnapper was out cold. Cigarette guy picked up the kidnapper by the back of his jacket and threw him down the stairs. You have no idea how scary and violent it is to see an unconscious man fall down the stairs like that. To this day, I still have a fear of falling downstairs, and he just bled everywhere. I still have no idea too how Cigarette Guy knew to help me, but I'm sure glad that he did. Maybe he could see tears in my eyes, or maybe he just picked up on something and had a bad vibe, but he acted instantly. The first second that he could, he attacked my would-be kidnapper, and Cigarette Guy starts pacing back and forth, swearing at himself, gritting his teeth and clenching his fists. I thought that he was mad at me, so I started to cry. He looked at me and said, Okay, shut up. He had a terrible attitude as well, so I listened to him out of fear. I wasn't as scared of Cigarette Guy as much as the bearded guy, but I was still in fear of him. He started to ask me questions with an attitude like, why are you out this late? Where are your parents? Why would you talk to strangers? I was just in so much shock and confusion that I couldn't answer the man's questions correctly. He asked if I knew my way home, and I told him that I didn't. I told him a broken story about what happened, and somehow with the information that I gave him, he knew where my mum's car was. The only thing that I remember about the road is passing a house with Christmas lights on it, despite Christmas already being over. I think that he knew the area well enough and figured out where I needed to go from that information, but I honestly don't even remember telling him about the Christmas lights. Anyways, he told me that he would take me back if I promised over and over that I wouldn't tell the police that I saw him or anyone that looked like him, and made me promise that I wouldn't even tell the police anything. Again, he was pretty scary, so I didn't care what he asked me to do. I just wanted to go back to my mum, so I agreed. I followed him down the stairs, and the bearded guy was still laying on the ground bleeding at the bottom of them. He wasn't moving at all, and for all I know, he may have even been dead. These days, I now hope that he was. Cigarette Guy stepped over the bearded guy, and I followed. We walked outside, and Cigarette Guy looked around panically. I remember him telling me, too, that the police don't like me. Well, we walked out of the projects, and my feet still hurt. Cigarette Guy was walking fast in a panic, and I had to basically jog to keep up with him. I started crying, and he asked what was wrong, and I told him that my feet hurt, and I remember him sucking his teeth and picking me up with an attitude. He awkwardly cradled me in both arms. He walked down the road for a moment, and then I remember him swearing and running behind a house or a building. A cop car was driving down the road. He put me down and told me to run to the police car. I tried to run, but my legs could barely move, and honestly, I was scared. The cop car kept driving and rode away without seeing me before I could even get remotely close to it. He kept swearing to himself as he picked me up again and ran down the street. He took me behind a lot of houses and hid from every cop car that drove by. I assume now that the police were looking for me. He carried me in both arms, running fast down the road when I saw my mum at her car in the distance. She was surrounded by police, and Cigarette Guy put me down and told me to run over there. I got so excited that the pain in my legs just disappeared, and he put me down and I just ran. I ran towards the police and my mum picked me up and she hugged me tightly. The police started to ask me and my mum questions, and I don't remember too much about their questions, but I remember my mum telling the police some convoluted story that just didn't make any sense. She basically told me not to say anything, and I didn't say much, but I cried a whole bunch. And then we went home. Days later, my dad picked me up and knew something was wrong. I told him everything, and after that, I never lived with my mum again. When I grew up and had time to think about that day, I never did forgive my mother. Not too long ago too, I asked my dad about what he remembers about the situation and told me what he thinks happened from what I explained to him from years ago. He said that my mum was on a drug binge. I got kidnapped. Someone saved me, but the person that saved me had warrants and wasn't mad at me. He was just frustrated with the situation that he had to deal with. Imagine being a criminal on the run and now having a kidnapped girl with you and you just beat a guy up half to death. If he would have gotten caught with me, he could have easily gone to jail for my kidnapping. But with my mum lying and me being in shock and confused, I wouldn't be able to tell them that the man helped me because while it was all happening, I didn't even notice that he was helping me. But to the man that saved me that night, I owe you a very big thank you. So to start, I'm a 23-year-old, at the time of this story, 19, 5'5", fat girl from England, and my weight and country come into play later. So I used to walk my dog at night, until this experience at least, but the kind where you can make out a fair bit but not perfectly. A disclaimer of that area is like middle of nowhere village, everyone knows each other, strangers or visitors are always spotted, all that stuff. A fair few of my neighbours walk late too, and the neighbour that I would meet most, who was always going out, was about 6'3", heavily tattooed, 46-year-old man with two very unfriendly big dogs, one Mastiff and one German Shepherd. We were great friends too, and still are, and the only other dog that his wouldn't attack was actually mine, so I had no worries at that late hour because he was normally just a shout away. The night that I bumped into him, though, was just ending his walk, which had happened a couple of times. No big deal and no worries. I'm around half an hour into my 45-minute walk anyway, in the woods, earphones with music playing, and just checking my phone for what song to play next, when I notice my dog is looking up as if he can see something. I assume that it's just another neighbour, a fox or a deer maybe. My dog doesn't chase anything, so it was normal that he didn't run after any animal. I looked up calmly to see a strange man standing around 20 to 25 feet away from me, holding a rifle. No dog. It wasn't hunting season, and this is England, so getting a gun unless you're a farmer, let alone a rifle, is pretty difficult. He looked shocked, but angry to see me there, and at this point, I remember my head torch is on, and he turns to look at me. He angles his face to me, and I knew that I couldn't turn around or run since I'm very out of shape, more so then, so I just carry on walking. As we go past, my dog gives a wide berth, which is unusual since he's so friendly and loves literally everyone and everything. When I was level with him too, he just shuffled and said, "Evening," and I responded with the usual "good evening" and speed walk out of there. I looked back over my shoulder as I was about to leave the woods, and I saw that he hadn't moved, just stood looking at me. I never walked alone at night again after that too. This freaked me out so much too because it has never happened and never happened again either, and any hunting near me has to be done in a certain area at a certain time of year. He could have been hunting, I suppose, but I'm sure that I would have heard a gun go off at some point since sound travels and I can hear bird scarers in other fields through my earphones. For context too, I didn't walk with my neighbour a lot because he was inconsistent with times due to work and it had been safe with no issues for 3 years before this. But what that guy was doing there at that time of night, in the forest with a rifle when he just shouldn't have been, is a complete mystery to me. I always believed in the supernatural, ever since I was a kid in fact. I would binge watch paranormal shows, read countless books about urban legends and ghost stories, and I would spend hours online reading people's supernatural experiences and videos that they captured on tape based on their experiences. I, for one, never thought that I would have stories to tell about the other side, until I looked back at my childhood and realized that there's always been something lurking behind me that I never figured out until just now. You see, for a while now, I felt like something had been following me, or more like attached to me, I suppose. Like hovering above me wherever I am. In fact, as I'm typing this, I'm actually getting a little bit anxious. I would tell my sisters things too that I thought that I saw or heard, and she would just say that it's all in my head, but I just never felt like I dreamt them up. There were so many experiences too that I've had that just felt too real to make it up. Like the time that I was a kid sleeping in my mum's bed and all of a sudden my legs got grabbed and I was dragged a bit out of the bed. It hasn't happened in years though, but still. I've heard about people being attached to the supernatural from either ghosts or even creatures that you would only find in horror movies. I sometimes feel like that's me, that there's something always with me and that I'm just never really alone. I have some stories too that I feel like is evidence, for me at least, proving that my theory is probably true, but also to share my stories to other people who quite possibly have had the same things happen to them. So maybe I won't sound crazy. But one of these stories happened a few months ago, probably around July, I think. Ever since I moved away from home, I've been renting this small apartment with one of my sister's co-workers. We don't really get along, however, and I don't feel comfortable here. I've just been having problems sleeping in my own room. I think it's just because at my old home I would sleep with the TV on, so it helped me sleep a lot more easily. So living in a new place with no TV in my room has probably just made it harder for me to sleep. And so, I've started to sleep on my living room couch, despite my roommate being totally against it. I put on paranormal videos or TV shows on so that I can listen until I fall asleep, so it wasn't usual for me to watch something scary to help me sleep or anything. One particular day though, I think it was my day off, so I was still sleeping till noon. I would wake up sometimes and just go back to sleep because I just kept having these really weird dreams. And then I woke up from somebody's voice, and it sounded like my roommate who said, "Hey, are you okay?" Still sleepy, I called out his name, but I didn't get a response. I turned my head to the left where the coffee table was, and I could see someone sitting there right in front of me. I could make out somebody's leg in a sort of sitting position, but not their face. In my dreamlike state, I assumed it was just my roommate, so I reached out to them and started to hit them lightly on their arm. And it felt real because I could feel them and I could clearly, even in my sleepy state, see them right in front of me. I was saying their name over and over again, but they just never responded. When all of a sudden, their appearance just changed. It wasn't my roommate. It was somebody else. They looked like a woman with a grey dress, and their hair was long past their shoulders, and it was such a dark shade of black that it was weird. Still, I couldn't make out the fade, but I felt their eyes were just staring at me. I kept saying my roommate's name like I was in a trance, and then just poof. I opened my eyes, and my hand was still in a hitting motion, but there was nobody there. I thought that maybe he just walked away, but when I called out to him and asked him if he was in his room, he said that he was there the whole time. I asked him if he called out to me, and he said that he never did and didn't know what I was talking about. But I swear to you that I felt someone there with me. I felt them. It was like a dream, but it wasn't at the same time. My eyes were so heavy that I couldn't open them to get a better look at what I saw no matter how much I tried. I only got them opened at the last minute, and what I saw was just gone. I still think about this from time to time, and I've even told my roommate and my sister too, but they believed it was just a dream, even though I told them that my hand was still in motion, like I was still hitting a person. And who knows, maybe it was just a dream, but the thing is that the lady that I saw, I think that I've seen her before at my old home. I'll admit that this is probably the first time that I've seen her in person and got to interact with her. I still sleep in the living room too, and I haven't had that happen again, but I still feel like I'm not alone in there and like I'm being watched. These days, I've been keeping the lights on to help me sleep since my roommate took the TV. I still don't think I dreamt it up, but maybe someone out there can give me some sort of an explanation about this whole experience. It's pretty creepy, to say the least, but I also find it interesting that something like that happened to me. Anyways, any explanations or theories in the comments would be greatly appreciated. And I'll write again if anything else happens. Thanks.
mum and dad are separated, and I currently live with my mum, sister, and my 2 dogs. I woke up 3 days ago at around 9 a.m. I was going to go to my dad's to clean his house, as he's been busy working 12 to 14-hour shifts. Despite being separated, me and him, along with my sister and mum, we all get along well, so I didn't mind. I get there and had to use the bathroom. I was sitting on the toilet on my phone, just browsing Instagram or something, when all of a sudden I heard that cliche reversed breathing sound that they use in horror movies, but it was right outside the door. Then, right after a wail, I freaked out and cleaned fast, and I just left ASAP. It was so close too that it sounded like it was right in front of me, behind the door. Later that night too, I got home from work, made 2 drinks and 2 grilled cheese sandwiches. I realized that it was too much for me, so I went to my mum's room upstairs to offer her some. She said that she was okay, so I said goodnight to her and my dogs. But later that night, I thought that she was still up, so I decided to go and chat with her a bit, but she was asleep. I ended up going to my room and I played some Overwatch. Around an hour into playing at about 12:30 is when it happened. I was just playing around and I was doing pretty well, but before I go into what I want to say, the volume in the TV was low as I didn't want to wake anyone up, but I still wanted to hear the game. My fan was on and it wasn't loud as it was on the lowest setting. I was still playing, focused on the game, but I had this overwhelming sense that something was watching me from the window to my left, which I can see all from our backyard from, and it was not the first time that I had this feeling too. A few minutes go by, and I try to ignore the feeling, eventually forgetting about it, more focused on my game instead. All is well until about 3 minutes later when I hear my mum's voice yell my name in what sounded like a panicked or scared voice, similar to when my dogs fight and I have to separate them, or similar to when she's scared of something. She also is sick pretty often, and her new medication could have some side effects. The voice came from the direction of my window and was not as loud, like she was in the backyard or something. Now, due to the previous reason explained, before I quickly dropped the controller and got out, I feared my mum was having a reaction to the medicine, or maybe one of my dogs ran out. I headed towards the window to go and see, but suddenly some strange fearful instinct just overcame me. Something in me just said, don't do it. Don't look out the window. Don't go near it. Something in me knew that whatever the hell that was outside was not my mother. Suddenly, I pulled away and closed the blinds without looming in fear. I sat back in bed and realized that I was still in the game. I texted my sister and asked if she was up, but got no reply, and I didn't text my mum because I was kind of afraid after that. But the game was still on, so I played it a bit to take the edge off of what had just happened. But while playing, I got a bit more clarity as to why it was not my mum outside though. I got some realizations about some stuff, and something just wasn't making sense. And here are the reasons that it was definitely not her. So first off, there is just no possible way that my mum can go downstairs without me seeing her go. All of our rooms are next to each other's. Mum's is on the right from mine, and my sister's on the left. If she went down, I'd be able to see her, since my room's door is right in the front of the stairs to go downstairs. I would have been able to see her turn on the light and hear the stairs creak as she went down too. Secondly, my dogs follow her everywhere, and they're extremely protective of my mum and go with her whenever she goes in the house and wherever she goes. If not following her, they sit somewhere near, but I would have heard them bark and make noise walking, or hear the jingle of their collars or something. If she was downstairs, they definitely would have been barking at something, or if it was my mum yelling my name on fear or pain from medication, they'd be barking to alert me and my sister as well. But again, none of that happened. And lastly, we have cameras inside the house as well. They're night vision and motion sensitive too, so every time there's movement, it captures it. But due to it being connected to an app on all of our phones, it sends us a notification and plays the recording too. And that didn't happen. I finally gathered the courage to get up and use the bathroom, along with stop by her room as it's next to it. After using the bathroom, I called her name. No reply. I slowly twist the doorknob and it was locked. I pressed my ear to the door and could hear my dog run to the door alerted. She sniffed under the door and panted in excitement when she realized that it was me.
She stuck her paw out and I pat it as she licked my finger, which meant that they were definitely inside. I continued listening and eventually I heard my mum breathing, sound asleep. The medication also helps her sleep, so she was definitely sound asleep. And honestly, guys, I have no idea what the hell was in my backyard. I don't know why it mimicked my mum's voice so well too, but my instinct, as soon as I knew it wasn't my real mum, said a lot. It really just didn't feel right. This isn't the first time too that I've heard a voice and have it not be her. I've heard it at my dad's house while me and my dogs were alone, after her and my dad went out to buy groceries for his house and ours. That time, however, it called my dog's name from my dad's room. His apartment is pretty small. You walk in and it's the kitchen, and on the left is the balcony, and straight ahead is the living room, and then a small intersection that is the bathroom to the left and his room to the right. I was on the couch and my dog Mia was on the other one in front of the room while my smallest Bella was next to me. And we all definitely heard my mum's voice call out Mia, and my dog instantly looked up towards my dad's room and turned her head to the side like dogs do when they're curious or confused. She then looked back at me, her eyes a bit wide, and gave me a very confused look. I really don't know what's going on, and I don't know what it is, and I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't scared a bit. If you guys have any suggestions or help, I would really appreciate it. Feel free to comment below and let me know if you're comfortable with it. I really want to find a solution and just make this stop. Any help is greatly appreciated. This happened while I was doing my army service in Switzerland. I'm not really allowed to talk about what we were doing, but I'll try to keep things clear. So my company had installed a huge antenna, and it had to be guarded by 2 soldiers day and night. We were on top of a hill, far from any city and near a huge forest. It was 1800 hours, and I just started my watch of 6 hours with another soldier. Everything went fine, and we smoked cigarettes, and we kept ourselves occupied until our watch ended at midnight. Then we received a call from our superior, and he told us that one of the soldiers that was supposed to take that watch couldn't come, and one of us had to stay for another watch for 6 hours. We tossed a coin to know who would stay from midnight to 6 in the morning, with temperatures of minus 20 Celsius degrees. And of course, I lost, and I had to wait for the other soldier to come and join me for the night watch. They sent Jon Snow. No, I'm kidding. They've only sent another soldier, but not the best because I knew he would sleep all night. When I saw him climbing the hill too with his sleeping bag, it was a guarantee, and that's what he did. He immediately took place in the tent and just fell asleep. It was truly one of the coldest and longest nights of my life, but nothing special. But the weird part happened in the morning. So we received another call from our superior, and he told us that we had an NBC exercise. It means that we have to wear all day long our anti-chemical suit. I don't know the English word for it, but it's the one with the gas mask and everything that goes with it. I was really upset and exhausted because I wasn't able to sleep with that thing on, and sleep was my only reward for that 12-hour watch. And well, I got out of the tent, and this is where I saw something that honestly scares me to this day. There was a woman standing next to the antenna, and she wasn't moving. She was just standing there, 5 meters from the tent. I couldn't see her face because of the sun starting to rise behind her. I knew that she was a woman because she had really long hair and she had curves. But remember too that we're in the middle of nowhere, and this lady was standing there, not moving, like she was just frozen. I started to freak out, and I called the other guy to show him what I was looking at. I don't know why too, but he wasn't scared at all and told her that she had to leave because she wasn't allowed there. But again, she just didn't make a move. She just stood there looking at us, or at least in our direction. I was just so confused too because, how a woman could ignore 2 soldiers telling her to leave a forbidden area, I just couldn't understand. We are in Switzerland. The army is not that impressive, I admit, but people usually don't do these kinds of things. They would just move away, especially when it's 6 in the morning. And what was she doing in the middle of nowhere anyway? Obviously not dressed for this cold weather. And how long was she standing there, and how did she end up there? I didn't hear any footsteps.
So many questions just were running through my mind at that moment. The other soldier didn't think twice and started walking towards her. When he almost reached her, she started running really fast. She ran directly into the forest, and I saw her getting down into the forest, and then she just disappeared from our sight. Now, I'm a really rational thinker. I question everything and think that there is always an explanation. For me, the explanation is that she was simply a jogger because of the way that she ran into the forest. But almost 3 minutes have passed between the first time that I saw her and the moment that she started running. 3 minutes of not moving at all, just looking at me, dressed with something really tight with minus 20 degrees in the middle of nowhere. I don't know. Thank God there was someone with me, because nobody would have believed me, even if I told them. And if anyone knows what I encountered that morning, please feel free to leave a comment. But to be completely honest, I'm not even sure if I want to know. My mother and my sister and I had a day out a few cities over, so we were generally all in a good mood as we walked by some vandalized buildings to get back to the car. I think that I may have been the one to spot him first. As far as I can remember, he was the only other person around aside from our group. He was dressed for the weather, in shorts and a long-sleeve shirt, and appeared normal. But after he caught sight of us, he almost immediately changed his trajectory towards us. I felt my mother stiffen slightly from where she stood beside me as he approached us. Even if the memory wasn't slightly foggy from the passage of time, I still wouldn't be able to make out all of the things that he said. But as far as I could tell, he was shouting something about God at my mother before he demanded to know if those girls were Catholics. My mother pushed us away from him slightly and stuttered out a response, clearly blindsided by the random question. My sister looked confused, but stayed silent, and I took the opportunity to move slightly to the side so that there was more distance between me and this random guy who had shouted about God in my mother's face. The guy then shoved a small package into my sister's and mother's hands while ignoring me completely. He shouted something like, "That's the word of God in those leaflets there. You better read them, or I'll kill you both." And at that point, I was seriously considering just decking him in the face or something, because he had shoved his own face way too close to my sister's to be any sort of comfortable. But my mother pushed her even further back while she hastily voiced her agreement. Seemingly satisfied, the man walked off, but not before shouting more random things in my mother's face. She just nodded and agreed with whatever he was saying, and as soon as he was out of sight, she placed a hand on both of our necks and hurried us along. I remember thinking at the time that the things that he had given them were clearly not leaflets, and I was proven right when my mother stopped walking after we were a good distance away and opened hers. She instantly recoiled and abandoned it and got my sister to do the same. My mother thought that it was tobacco, but my sister said that it looked more like pubic hair. And for being screamed at in her face by some random guy, she was rather nonplussed about the entire thing. As we were leaving in the car, my mother caught sight of the same guy having an argument with another man. My sister and I both looked and got to bear witness as he climbed on top of a car and started stripping. Needless to say, we didn't stay long after that. This happened a long time ago and was one of the first encounters that I've had. I was 9 years old, staying with my grandma on a reservation. I'm Native American, Cree, and I was only supposed to be there for a day, but then it started to storm badly, lasting nearly 4 days in fact, and to this day it's one of the worst storms that we've had. The power was out for maybe 3 days or so. No lights, no stove, nothing. The layout of my grandma's house is pretty important too. I don't think you would even call it a house though, it was kind of just a trailer house, the kind you see in Trailer Park Boys. It must have been the third night too, because the day after we ate boiled eggs. So my cousin and my aunt were all sleeping in the living room, and from where I was sleeping, you could see through the kitchen window, which was pretty small, 2x4 really, when I was woken up by the sound of something talking in a really strange voice. At the time, I couldn't think of what it reminded me of, but now, after thinking about it for years, it sounded like a goat trying to speak English. I still don't know what it was trying to say, but I heard, "Hey, boys, hey." And at first, I thought that it was just my cousin being annoying, but
Then I noticed that there was a big figure standing outside of the kitchen window that had its fists against the glass. And then I noticed that it was banging on the window, but not hard enough to make a ton of noise. I saw the outline of horns, similar to bighorn goats, fur covering its entire body from what I could see. And then lightning flashed, and I saw its face. It's very hard to describe, but it looked like what you would imagine a goatman to look like, I suppose, and maybe a bit more on the goat side. It also seemed to have red eyes, but not glowing, although that could have just been reflection. It looked old and rough. Its fur was mostly grey with some brown. The window that it was at was maybe 6 feet above the ground, or more because I don't really remember. Plus, the trailer burned down a few years back, so I would say that it was 7.5 feet tall. Throughout the night, too, it stayed in place, but the banging turned to scratching, and the attempts to speak turned to growls and shouting. Lightning flashed a few times more, and every time I could see the anger on its face growing more and more. I eventually woke up my cousin crying. She came and laid with me until eventually I fell asleep. I had a hard time falling asleep because every time that I closed my eyes, I would see eyes just looking back at me. And when I did finally fall asleep, I had a nightmare involving the goatman. And in my dream, I watched him walk over to our neighbors and brutally murder them and come back with a decapitated head, swinging it around in my face. He was taunting me, and why, I still don't know. What's weird is that my cousin said that she couldn't see it, but she could hear it. The growling, the scratching, and everything. We talk about it often too, and I remember at one point moving to another room and looking outside of the window and seeing its full body, which was not like a minotaur, but more like a centaur. It noticed me too, and that was when I ran back to the living room. I should also mention that the morning after, we checked outside for evidence and we found huge hoof prints going from window to window and scratch marks on the window as well. The prints were probably the size of about 2 open hands, I think. Now, I've read countless stories and none of them come close to this night. It was definitely the most scary encounter that I've had to this day, and I've seen a few things in my life and it tops them all. Before starting this story, I want to acknowledge that I fully put myself into this position, but this is still one of the most potentially dangerous encounters that I've ever had, so I wanted to share it. At the time, I was 19 and barely scraping together enough money to eat a few times a week, and I worked about a 2.5-hour walk away from my crappy apartment. This particular day was 2 days before payday, and I didn't have $1 to take to the bus, so I decided to just walk to work since I regularly walked that sort of distance anyway. I took off, and a couple of miles into the trip, it started to rain, like a total torrential downpour. Of course, I didn't have an umbrella or jacket too, and was wearing slippery flip-flops, so the rest of the walk was looking pretty daunting, but I had to get to work because I didn't have a cell phone to call and explain, and I needed to keep that job. Shortly after the rain started up, a man in a pickup truck pulled over and asked if I needed a ride. I knew full well that hitchhiking is a bad idea, but at the time I honestly didn't care. I was at a weird point in my life with a newly manifesting mental illness and really didn't think too much about putting myself in harm's way, because I just didn't care much about the outcome. So, of course, I decided that it would be better to get a ride with him than to walk the rest of the way. I get in the truck with him and I tell him where I need to go, and he says sure thing, and we start heading that way. He asks some strange questions like, where do I work, do I have a boyfriend, family in the area, etc., but I was just happy to have someone to talk to, so I answered them all and didn't think too much of it. But we were getting close at this point, like I could see the mall that I worked at, and he asked if I'd like him to buy me a pack of cigarettes or anything. I said yes, that would be awesome. So he turns, of course, but passes the gas station. He saw me look at him weird and just said, oh, he had to stop by his apartment and get his wallet. At that point, I knew things were weird, but again, I was more curious than afraid, so I was like, okay, sure thing.
But we get to his apartment, and it is in the basement of one of those super old giant houses that people divide up into apartments. And it's the kind of stairs going down where you go below ground level, outside with the concrete going up on both sides. There are no windows whatsoever, so I said that I'd wait in the truck, and he kept insisting that I go in with him because he just got a new stereo and wanted to show me. I knew that this was total bullcrap, but again, I just wanted to see what would happen, so I went with him anyway. I guess my thought was that if things got actually dangerous or something, a fight sounded nice that day anyway, and if he won, so what? So let's see where things go. Yes, I was that mentally ill at the time. So I go down the stairs and step in the door, but I did at least have the smarts to not go in further than a few feet and keep myself between him and the door. He wanted me to go into another room with him, so I just said, "No man, I've got to get back to work and you're going to make me late. Get your wallet so you can get me my cigarettes and let's go." He went into another room for a minute and then came out with an open beer and handed it to me and wanted me to just have one beer with him before we left. Yeah, right, I thought. I told him that if he thought that I was that stupid, that he had another thing coming. I'd been promised cigarettes and a ride to work, and that's what he was going to do, because otherwise he'd have a problem on his hands, because I literally do not give a crap right now, and he doesn't know what I'm capable of. A bold statement for a 5'5", 19-year-old woman weighing in at 95 pounds, mind you. But again, mentally ill, really didn't give a crap, and was no stranger to fights, so I wanted to try my luck. Surprisingly, he put the beer down, said, "Well, okay then, let's go." And we went back outside and got back into the truck. He did go to the gas station and got me cigarettes, and then he dropped me off at work as promised. And when he dropped me off, he said something to the effect of me being a lot more bold than I look like I'd be, and I'm so sorry for the trouble, and that was that. I never saw him again. I still don't know what his intentions were with taking me to his apartment, but I can't imagine that they were good. Even though my mental illness got me into that situation, I think it probably also saved me by keeping me from being the easy target that he was expecting. I still can't believe I ever accepted a ride from him in the first place, much less that I followed him into that apartment out of curiosity. But thank God that it all turned out just fine. I probably should have gotten his plates and called the cops or something, I know, but I didn't because I had my cigarettes and I was at work, so I was happy and I didn't even think of it. A couple of years ago, my family and I had just gotten home mid-morning from a road trip vacation. Everyone went to their rooms to get some sleep since we'd been traveling all night without rest. I wasn't too tired though, so I just went to my room. Sitting on my bed, I had a direct view of my window that only has curtains, and that day I had drawn my curtains open because it was a quiet and calm early afternoon, blue sky that looked really nice. My window is about 6.5 feet tall from the ground outside, and from my window I can see my backyard, which is enclosed. But we have a tall fence enclosing it, and all the gates are locked all the time. It's hard to climb up for even an adult, let alone a kid. I've even tried often in my childhood when I forgot my keys to the house, but that's why what I saw next, I know, did not come from the outside or another neighbor's home. So I'm reading on my bed when I glance up at the window, and that's when I see him, a young boy at the window just staring at me. I don't even know how to react if I'm being honest. Did we leave the gates unlocked or something? I just stared back at him, kind of dumbfounded. He stared back at me with a very silent and childlike gaze. And then I realized that I could see him from the chest up, but he wasn't holding onto anything, or seemingly holding onto anything as his hands looked to be at his side. I recall that the bottom side of the window from the outside is around 7 feet tall, so what I'm seeing is basically impossible. Upon realizing this too, I felt uncontrollably uncomfortable, wondering how in the world he was able to get up that high. Thinking that I was just hallucinating or something, I dove off my bed to get a rational explanation. I felt a little put off at this point, but not exactly scared. Approaching the window, I kept eye contact and noticed his eyes were so similar to the blue sky, and I don't even know why, but that's the only feature that I can remember now.
Kind of cliche, I know, that the only colour of his eyes was the thing that I remember, but that's what it was. Besides him being a young boy, that is. Then, when I was about a foot close to the window, he just vanished into thin air in the blink of an eye. It was shocking, to say the least, but looking at the window, there was nothing that he could stand on and nowhere that he could have run to without me seeing him. I felt really uneasy and I left the room afterwards and eventually fell asleep in the living room away from any windows. I have no idea what it was that I saw, but looking back on it now, I'm still very sure that I did see it because I can remember exactly how I felt and how the events took place. Strangely though, when I remember it, I don't really feel fear, but rather it's in a place of a sense of calmness or something, which obviously is very strange. This happened a few days ago. So I left for work around 9 and my husband was home with my son for the day. I went to lunch at 12:30 and at 1 I get a call from an unknown number. Usually I ignore these calls, but something just told me to answer this one. And my 5-year-old son was on the other end crying. He said that he was taking a nap and when he woke up, his daddy was gone. I said, okay, I'll come over since I'm still on lunch. I thought that maybe my husband went to work in the garage or take a shower or something and just freaked my son out a little bit when he woke up. I tell him to stay on the line and that it's about a 10-minute drive for me. He doesn't say much, but I can still hear his breathing on the other end. And this is where it gets freaky. I have chills even telling this part, but as soon as I enter the end of my block, the phone call just ends. I pull into the driveway and his car is still there, the front door is shut. My neighbour is getting groceries from his car, so I say a quick greeting and I head inside. My son and husband are sitting on the couch watching TV though. My husband is playing on the cell phone and I asked him what happened and he's extremely confused. I tell him about the call and he acts like he doesn't believe me. I thought that it was just a terrible prank from him, so I asked my son, did you call mummy and say that you couldn't find daddy? And he said no, can I have a juice box? And I mean, he's just too young to be good at lying, so I 100% believe him. I honestly feel like I'm just going crazy at this point, and I asked if my husband ever left the room or gave our son the cell phone. He says no to both, and I check the call logs on the phone and there's nothing. We don't have any other phones of any type in the house, and I still just really don't know what happened, but I'm beyond creeped out at this point. Now, I know my son's voice, and there's no doubt in my mind that it was him. I mean, maybe if he was younger, but at 5 years old, I can tell distinctly that it was his voice. I can see how maybe it was a scammer, but how would anyone be able to mimic his voice so perfectly? I don't know how someone could steal his voice because he doesn't like to talk on phones, and I've only had a handful of recordings of him where his voice is high-pitched and happy, but it was him on the phone, crying. For those who are suggesting for me to call back an unknown number, they must know what that means. I just get an automated message saying that this number is not available. Also, I still have no idea why I answered it. I just felt like I needed to for some reason, almost an overwhelming feeling. I mean, I always ignore these calls, but this one, for some strange reason, just felt different. So, I think it was winter of 2016 or 2017 when my best friend at the time moved in with me, along with a guy that I met on Facebook who recently moved to Idaho from Utah. Now, it was around 9 o'clock one night when my best friend and I were in the small gym at our complex when we heard several police sirens going back and forth down the road outside. But we lived in a pretty low crime area and we didn't think too much of it, but it was way more police than usual, so it was a bit odd. After a while, a man came storming into the gym and walked around tugging on doors to maintenance closets or ones that led to other areas of the building, all of which were locked because residents were not allowed in most of these areas, especially after hours. I asked the man, hey, how's it going? Can I help you with something? The man responded,
I'm doing alright. I'm just checking in on some things. Have a good night." And then he left. My friend and I discussed how strange that he was acting. We thought that he was maybe a maintenance guy or something because of the keys that hung from his belt loop. But the news that came the next day was much more terrifying. A man had stabbed his girlfriend several times and left her in his car before fleeing the scene just down the road from our complex, and the cops hadn't found him yet. And the description that they gave on the news matched. We are 100% sure that it was him that we saw that night. I've been in Alaska for more than 2 years, and I'm stationed in Fort Wainwright. Every so often we go to field missions, and where we go is super isolated. Me and a few guys were tasked out to drive down this mountain that we're currently doing our training on, and we replied yes, reluctantly too, because we just want some real food rather than MREs that we have been living off for the past few days. Anyway, while 2 of the soldiers were ground guiding me, and my battle I'll call Knox, out of the runway, we noticed that it started getting dark, like really fast. Being on that mountain though is hardly ever any light, unless it's from the moon. But just to get a general idea, you could see the northern lights pretty easily. As we drive, Knox is telling me that he has to piss really bad, so I tell him to pull over. As he begins to pull over, it just got extremely quiet. I felt as if someone punched me in my gut because I started to get this really strong sense of something is watching me, and I started to get goosebumps. I took it with a grain of salt though, that maybe it was just the MRE making my stomach hurt and the weather making the hairs on my skin stand. But then I felt paranoid, and I've never felt this way before in the field because I've been here numerous times before. As he walks back to the truck, I see the foliage on my right-hand side fall as if a weight was being forced on it. I tap Knox's shoulder and I tell him to look in my direction, and it was a moose, but it looked oddly skinny and the antlers just didn't look normal. Our eyes got huge and he responded, "What the hell is that thing?" I stammered because I wasn't too sure what it was either. He buckled up and pressed the brake, but we heard help coming from the direction of the moose. My heart dropped and I felt the heat leave my face, and I looked at him asking, "Did you hear that, or was it just me?" He replied, "Bruh, I heard that shit." He laughed nervously and we turned off the truck and shined our headlamps toward the moose's direction. We are 89B, so we carry our standard M4s with us in the vehicle when we're transporting ammo, whether there's anything in the cans or not, just cause it's for our safety. Knox and I looked into the cab to just verify that we have our weapons on us, and we did. I jumped out of the cab and we followed with our headlamps still on the moose. We walked close and the word help was getting louder and louder at this point. We got a few more feet closer, but not extremely close to the moose, and the moose just ran back into the woodline, making me and Knox jump. We looked at each other and we were both probably thinking the same thing. Did that moose just cry for help? I told him that I was getting cold and he agreed the same, so we paced back to the truck as fast as we could. But as I closed the door, we heard the words help, but louder than it was earlier. I got that gut feeling right after that I heard the words help again, and I looked into the dark woodline, and this time, I swear to you that I saw red eyes. I gulped and I told him to look at the woodline, but he put the truck in drive and he just sped off. We talked for a few minutes about the situation, and it was complete silence following right after that. When we got done with the mission, he sped up the mountain to get back to where the rest of the company was, and he just didn't say a word. He sleeps on the cot next to me, and he didn't speak to anyone about the situation. I'm a bit shook from the situation myself, and I always wanted to experience a skinwalker thing, and I'm not too sure if I did or not, but I'm sorry I never went into the woodline if someone did call for help, but I've just heard too many stories and listened to too many podcasts to try it. But what do you guys think that we encountered? I never even thought that a skinwalker
would be in Alaska. This story happened to me when I was 15, and my family had moved across the country to a town that was much smaller than the one that we had lived in previously. For privacy reasons, I won't name it. Yes, it's that small. But down the street from my high school was this strip of local stores, one being a butcher shop. Upon moving, I hadn't made a ton of friends, and didn't for a pretty long time, in fact. One of my best friends to this day was the one that introduced me to the story of the meat man. This was after being friends for a few weeks, and she told me that this meat shop had been accused of mishandling their products or something, and that the owners, husband and wife, were pretty creepy, especially the husband, and hence the name Meat Man. A few weeks passed, and I forgot about what she had told me. I didn't have to pass it on my walk home or anything, so it was never at the front of my mind. But one day, while I was at school, my mum texted me asking if I'd pick up a chuck roast, because she wanted to make her infamous Mississippi roast, and it's actually delicious, and I totally recommend it. So, forgetting about what my friend had told me, I walked to the shop after school. It was pretty small and very cold inside. Upon entering, I was met with the man who ran the shop, or so I assumed. He was probably 6 feet tall and had long grey hair, and he was stocking the front glass container as I walked closer to the front. I had asked him if he had chuck roast, and he smirked at me and said yes. He had asked me what I was using it for, so I vaguely told him about my mum's roast. He said that it sounded good and that he'd love an invitation to dinner sometime. I remember laughing and telling him maybe next time. And this is when it gets weird. He then comes around the container to where I'm standing and tells me that he has a chuck roast in the back. He offers to let me go back with him, but I politely decline. He then told me that if I wanted the roast, that I'd have to go back and get it myself. Now, I may have been young, but I wasn't stupid, so I politely declined again and told him that I needed to be home soon, so I'd appreciate it if he'd just go and get it for me. What he said next still sends chills down my bones. He goes, "What's to be scared of? You don't think I'm going to do anything back there, do you?" I remember in that moment feeling like I was going to puke. I considered whether or not it was worth it to buy the roast, and I decided that it just wasn't in the end. So I told the man that I wasn't interested in the roast, and I made my way outside. As I was walking down the sidewalk, I looked back, and he was standing outside of his shop, almost smiling, watching me just walk away. I ran home and I called my mum, just in tears. I was paranoid that entire week as well, that I'd be out and happen to run into him. Luckily, I haven't seen him since, but I sure do wish that I had listened to my friend that time. I live in British Columbia, Canada, and every summer my family likes to go out on weekend trips in order to get away and relax. This past summer, we decided to head out to Vancouver Island to explore and visit the beaches. Beautiful place, by the way. So, my family was driving out to the northern tip of Vancouver Island when we came across some road construction. We were in the middle of a heavily forested area, stuck in traffic, waiting for the crews to wave us along. Naturally, I fell asleep in the car too. I woke up in what felt like maybe an hour later, I think, to see that we still weren't moving. I looked to my dad, and his eyes are just fixed on the road, still waiting on the crews to wave us forward. My mum is asleep in the back seat, and my little sister is staring out the window listening to music. I remember thinking at the time that it was just oddly quiet for a construction site. No sounds of machines or heavy equipment, but it didn't seem significant at the time, so I just let it go. My eyes naturally gravitated towards the passenger side window as well, when something caught my eyes. On the side of the road beside a cluster of trees, I see what appeared to be a young girl standing beside a tree, just looking over at us. I would have to guess that she would have been older than 10 or 11, I'd say. At first, I assumed that it's just a girl from one of the cars lined up behind us, also stuck in traffic, as it wouldn't be too out of the ordinary to assume that a kid just got bored sitting in the car and decided to explore the surrounding woods or something. But what stuck out to me as just very different
were the clothes that the girl was wearing. They seemed old, and she was wearing a white sundress with little blue dots and a black headband. Now, again, this was in August, so not too out of the ordinary, I guess. She was just kind of pacing around back and forth in between the trees on the side of the road too, and I realized that I must have looked super weird just looking at this girl, so I decided that I was just overthinking things. That was before she and I made brief eye contact, to which I responded with a smile and a friendly wave. She waved back and also smiled at me, but that was when I noticed another defining feature that really puzzled me. Her eyes. They were completely blue, like her pupils, and what should have been the whites of her eyes were a deep navy blue. I tried to remain as calm as possible and slowly began to look away as I was completely freaked out at this point. It was then that a boy also emerged from behind one of the trees. He appeared to be a little bit older, maybe 15 or so. He was quite lanky, with freckles on his cheeks, and he was wearing a band t-shirt with jeans or something and Adidas sneakers. The eyes were the same shade of navy blue, and they both began to beckon over to me as if to get me out of the car and join them in the woods. Being pretty creeped out at this point, I looked back at my sister to see if she was seeing this, and as I assumed, she was also staring out of the window, eyes wide in disbelief. I then noticed that she's slowly reaching for the car door, eyes still fixed on the two kids who are now beckoning a little more urgently. And then the looks on their faces go from friendly to impatient and then a little aggressive if I had to put my finger on it. I proceed to shout her name to get her to snap out of whatever trance that she was in. I try to get the attention of my dad beside me, but to my horror, I realize that I can't speak. Like my lips were moving, but no words were coming out of my mouth. I tried shaking my head, but he seemed completely unfazed and kept his eyes glued to the road. My sister also tried shaking my mum awake, but to the same effect. As I'm trying to remain calm, I tell my sister to just close her eyes and count to 20 with me, kind of in sign language. That's something my parents and I used to tell her when she was younger in order to get her to calm down her anxiety. I hadn't done that in years, but I had to do something, right? Together, though, we both closed our eyes and started counting together. When we opened them again, the world just suddenly seemed to come alive again. I could hear the sound of construction workers yelling at each other, as well as the sounds of engines of the other cars surrounding us, and I looked outside, and unsurprisingly, the kids were just gone. I looked over and asked my dad how long we'd been in the traffic for, and he said roughly 10 minutes. When we finally got moving again, I wasted no time in telling my parents what I had seen. However, my dad told me that he glanced over at me a couple of times and I was just zoned out, staring out the window apparently. The rest of our vacation went by normal. Nothing out of the ordinary happened and we all had a good time. My sister even seemed to just play it off as a weird dream that we for some reason shared. It was when we got home, though, to the mainland that I started really looking into my experience. I, of course, held on to the possibility that I had just dreamt the whole thing, but I always come back to the fact that my sister and I were both very conscious, or at least had the same experience, and can both recall these little details. I've looked all over the internet and I've seen some similar stories of blue-eyed children, but nothing really matching me and my sister's experience. I'm sharing this here to see what everyone else has to say about it. I know it's a little long, but it really does intrigue me, and if nothing else, I'll have a creepy story to tell at campfires or when hanging with friends. The biggest question, though, that still resonates with me to this day is, what would have happened to us if my sister and I had actually gotten out of that car? So this story has been told to me by my mum a few times, in fact, and every single time, I still get that creepy, eerie feeling that someone is watching me. My mum is from a small town in Mexico, and when she was around 14, she had the habit of waking her mum up to go to the restroom since it was an older home and the restroom was located outside. My mum tells me that it was around 3 in the morning when she woke up and felt the need to use the restroom urgently. So she began calling out for her mum, and after a while of her mum not responding, she began getting agitated and started screaming. It was at this point that my mum turns around, and at the foot of her bed, she sees her mum standing there. She was wearing a white robe, but had a very bleak expression on her face, and both of her arms were extended. My mum said that she suddenly felt extremely cold and had a huge sense of dread. She had never seen her mum wear a white robe like this. That's when she looked down and saw her mum's feet weren't touching the floor. At that moment, she screamed and quickly threw the covers over her head. Her mum, wearing something completely different, mind you, runs in to find my mum shaking in her bed. Nobody believed my mum, and everyone told her that it was just a dream. Until a few days later, there was a power outage, and during this, my mum and a few of her siblings, with her parents, all decided to sleep in the living room. At around the same time of 3 a.m., they heard the same undeniable wails down their street, and none of them slept that night. We moved to the house when I was 5 years old. Suburban England. The previous owner was an elderly man, 70s, who cared for his mother, 100s, in the home until she died in the downstairs room, which my parents converted to a dining room. He was a deeply religious man too, and donated to every church within a 10-mile radius. My parents still get begging letters 26 years later, asking for more money from the churches to ensure his place is in heaven. This house, though, something was definitely in there with us. Me and my younger brother, for my 20 years in the house at least, repeatedly experienced things well beyond my reasoning. I'm an aerospace engineer, extremely scientifically minded, and reasoned in everything that I come across. I try to explain everything with science, and my brother, being a teacher, always had the mindset for theory-based practicality too. If there was no theory, it just couldn't be real. My first memories are around 6 or 7 years old, and this specific one would be ever present until around 11. So my parents used to make me sleep with the door open so they could check up on me easily. Every night though, I would wake up and there was a shadow in the hallway. It didn't watch me or didn't seem interested in me, but it was just ever present. In a dark unit hallway, a person-shaped outline was darker than the rest of it, and I used to hide under my covers until I could just drift off to sleep. But then, when I was 11, I had enough, and eventually I closed the door on it, and I never had trouble again. I'm now 30 with a family, and I have a crippling fear of sleeping with any door open in case I see it. TVs in the house always behaved weird too when we were a family and we would come home from a family outing. Almost as if we were being welcomed in or something. We would walk in the door, and whichever room we went into first, the television would switch on and display static. This was in the mid-90s to early 2000s when we had 5 channels and big boxes on the back of the TV. It was absolutely absurd, but in the end we just got used to it. Then as TVs developed, we got a flat screen, and this thing just never occurred again. Not until later on at least, but that's coming up. Now, this is one of my brothers, and 18 years later, he still swears by it. I was 12 and he was 8. He was looking for my mother and saw her in the dining room, sat looking out the window on the stool that is normally in the corner, wearing a grey shawl, and her normally blonde hair was straw-like now. He called to her, "Mum," but there was no reply. He walked in and prodded her in the back, as a clumsy 8-year-old would when needing attention, and he says that her head turned around 180 degrees while her body faced the window still, and she was grotesquely old, and not my mum at all. He screamed and ran out of the room. This is where me and my mum heard the commotion, screaming and thumping as he ran into the chairs and the table trying to get away, and we found him hiding in the downstairs toilet crying his eyes out. It was around the same time as this too. I was 12-ish, and it was just me, Mum, and my brother at home, whilst my dad was at the pub. We were all asleep, and I'd spent the whole day taking bricks from the garden and storing them in the loft. It was to get them out of the way whilst we renovated the garden. It was around midnight when I was woken up by the loudest banging in the loft that I'd ever heard. My mum had also been woken by it. We thought that all the bricks had been knocked over by a squirrel or something that had gotten in. Terrified though, my mum still forced me to go and take a look in the loft. We didn't have a ladder available, so I got on her shoulders and took a torch and looked around. But when I looked up there, nothing had fallen. Nothing was out of place. It had honestly sounded like something in a horror movie when all is tense and quiet and suddenly just somebody hammers on the front door with force, making everybody jump. It was that kind of sound, but there was nothing there. Fast forward to 17, and my parents had gone away for a week with my brother, so I stayed home alone. I was sat at my computer in my room playing Football Manager 2005 and heard my dad call my name. Then my brother called my name, and it sounded urgent, as if something was happening and I needed to help them. I came out of my room and I shouted, "What?" but there was no response. I got to the top of the stairs when I realized that I was home alone and they were all on holiday. I had a girlfriend at the time. This was our first time alone together and a chance to lose the V card, if you catch my drift. We were on the sofa, cuddling and kissing and fondling, when suddenly there was a loud bang from the kitchen next door. I checked it to find the pin board, which had been a permanent fixture since we moved in, was now on the floor. Thinking that the wind must have blown it, there were no windows open, which was strange. I just went back up and back to losing my virginity. But no, back in the living room, we're getting it on, and another bang. This time followed by absolutely booming footsteps, as if somebody had steel boots on, up the stairs and a door slammed shut. And it was at this point that we absolutely shat ourselves, thinking that we have a break-in, so I get her to call the police and I go up to check. She has no phone signal at all. I check the kitchen and the calendar is now on the floor, and I head upstairs and every single door was open. Now, when my parents left, all the doors were closed other than mine, and the bathroom to show to not to go in there. Every single door, though, was now open, even the cupboards. She had gone for the house phone now, which was also oddly disconnected, no service, which really freaked us out. But I put the calendar back up in the kitchen, grabbed our shoes, and we just ran out of the house, and we went about 200 meters away until we got phone service again, called her mum to come and pick her up, and I went back and found the calendar on the floor again. And after that, she never came back round again. Age 22 now, I moved out and lived on an RAF base for about 14 months, I think. In a 200-year-old building, I was put in the west wing alone, whilst everybody else was in the east wing. And now, the place was pretty well kept, but zero internet reception or mobile signal, and the only port was for an old schoolbox TV antenna. I took the one from home, left it in the loft for some 15 years at this point. I was dating the girl who was now my wife, and she recalls this just as well as me. She was home, but every night for 2 straight weeks, I woke up, wide awake as if I'd been well rested. I would look at my clock and it was always 3 a.m. on the dot. It was literally every night for about 14 straight days as well. And on the final night that I woke up at 3 a.m., suddenly there was a noise. 2 people talking in my room. I was so shocked that I immediately jumped up, but when I did, nothing was there. But the noise was from the blank screen TV. And this TV had been unplugged while I moved things around and not put back in. I didn't listen to what it was saying, but I got up and I walked towards it, when suddenly the static came on, which made me jump back a bit, and the TV said the words loudly, "It's fine," and then just turned off. Nothing happened again, and I never woke up again at 3 a.m. at the base and never experienced a thing there after that. Age 27, me and my wife moved into a temporary flat before we moved into our current house. It was 12 apartments with 1 immigrant family, the rest unoccupied. We were only there for 6 months, but some of the things that I experienced mentally have just scarred me. I'll only mention 5 of them. The first, my partner was in the bath and myself in the living room just watching TV. I heard her shout my name, so I came to the door and I asked what she wanted. She denied calling me. Her voice was from the opposite side of the bathroom, at least 10 steps from the door, and I said to her, Are you okay? Do you need anything while I'm here anyway? And it was at this point that I hear the lock sliding open while she says on the other side of the bathroom, "No, I'm fine." Then the door opens and she's lying in the bath and she asks how I got in. We were both puzzled, but then we hear her shout my name from the living room where I originally was. I quickly went in there, but when I got there, nothing was there. We did Halloween at my flat, and one of my friends slept over in the lounge. In the night, he texted me, "Why were you banging on the wall above my head all night? You kept me awake." He didn't realize that the wall that he was sleeping against wasn't the one against my room, though, in which I was fast asleep, mind you, but the one for the hallway. Now, the third is a minor incident, but my brother was sleeping over while the wife was at her parents'. I had a dream that I was in the flat and walking around, but it was cold, like really cold. And elsewhere, I could hear somebody calling for help. Like somewhere else in the flat, I kept hearing help. I walked into the living room and my brother was lying there, awake, just staring at me. In my dream, of course. And then he called my name. Eventually, I was woken up and he was actually calling my name, so I walked in the room and he was sat looking in the same direction that I had dreamt. And he told me that he was woken up by footsteps walking around the flat, and then he was looking and they were coming towards him, so he called me to wake up and check. Another incident where my wife was getting out of the bathroom. I thought that I would be cheeky and that I would hide in the living room and jump out at her and scare her. I heard the door open, footsteps come down the hallway, and her shadow come down the hallway too. I must admit, though, that it did look a bit off because it just didn't look like a human, if that's the right word. It seemed like a woman with like a long bird beak, similar to those ancient plague masks, moving along without any bodily movement like walking. I was kind of freaked out, so I gave up my plan and looked around my flat to find out why my wife's shadow looked that way, and maybe having a drink or maybe a towel or something. But when I did, I couldn't find her. So I went back to the bathroom and she was still in the shower. So whose shadow was that? The most terrifying for me, though, was I was lying in bed alone at about 9 p.m. and I rolled over and there was just a woman in the corner of the room. A white figure about 7 feet in the air, and I know this because the face was above the doorframe. It was looking right at me and I felt completely threatened, as if this thing did not like me at all. It was so clear too that I could even make out the facial features. Then it started drifting directly at me, downwards towards me in the bed, and then it vanished as it got about 2 feet away from my face. Obviously, I absolutely crapped myself. I screamed so loud that my wife came running in, and I just slept under the covers with a lamp on for about 3 months after that, and couldn't be alone in that room. If I came home from work, I would just run and close the door before I could see anything until she came home from work too. Another incident a little bit freaky in that flat was that I was talking in my sleep, but a full conversation that I have no memory of. It woke my wife up and she asked what I was doing, and I turned to her and said something along the lines of, "They're here with us." And then I just laid down and I went back to sleep. I moved into my new house after my granddad died, and it was his that I purchased off his children, and ever since then, nothing has happened. So this story took place about 12 years ago. I'm a 26 female, so I was 14 when this happened. Minnie was my best friend, and we were both the same age and both freshmen in high school. Val was around 10 or 11, I think. We spent so much time together, and at this point, I was spending the night at her house almost every weekend. Minnie and her family lived in a mobile home park not far from my house, and this mobile home park was absolutely beautiful and very well kept, with several different little parks throughout it. The biggest out of all these parks is in the very back and had a big playground with lots of swings, a basketball court and a tennis court. It's important to the story, I promise.
So basically, there were a lot of things to do, and we always felt safe walking around without an adult. But of course, you can never escape creepy and unusual people. I should also mention, too, that there was one house that everyone agreed the family was just really strange, and there was always just sketchy-looking people coming and going from that house, and as we got older, we realized that the son of that old couple was some sort of a drug dealer. So this particular day was a Friday, and I don't remember why, but our school had a half day, so we got out early. I would be staying at Minnie's place until Sunday morning, so we were both incredibly excited, and after being on the computer for a while, we got bored of being inside, so Minnie, Val, and myself decided to go to the big park. We told their dad where we were going, and we set off to the park. The big park was not far from where their house was. It only took about a minute or two to get there by walking. Minnie and Val decided to stop by other houses first so we could get more girls to come and hang out. And by the time that we got to the big park, there was about 15 of us girls ranging in ages of 9 to 14. We were at the park for a couple of hours just playing different games and whatnot when I first noticed this guy. He didn't look that old, maybe in his 30s or something, but he was just really dirty and, from appearance, honestly seemed homeless. I can't remember his face that well, but what I do remember is the top of his nose, and that it was just really close to his eyes and was all crooked. This is important, I promise. He was definitely not someone who had been there before, so we all focused on him. He was a couple of 100 feet away from us, and the way that he was acting had all of us kind of freaked out. Now, as an adult, I know now that he was high on something and tweaking out pretty hard, but my 14-year-old self just had no idea. He was standing in one spot, but was moving and contorting his body while making weird-ass noises. We were all at the playground just staring at this guy, too scared to move, when he just goes quiet and turns his head towards us. Even though none of us were moving, I just felt like that is when we all stopped breathing. He then starts making his weird noises again and then just yells out, "Girls, pretty girls," and starts moving toward us. One of the other girls screams, and we've all had enough, and we just start running in the same direction. We all ran down a different street than the one that we came on, and even though we were scared, Minnie and I were the older ones in the group, and we watched the rest of the girls run into their homes. I looked behind us to see if the guy was following us, and I never saw him. After everyone else is home, Minnie and I run to her house. Val had already ran home with her friend that lived next door. When we got back home, Val had already told her dad about the scary man at the park, and he questions us about the incident and then calls a friend of his who lives near the park that we were at. According to his friend, he heard the guy making this weird noise and saw him scare us, so he scared the guy off by threatening to call the police. Now, before continuing, I want to mention that Minnie's room is in the front of the house, so her window faced the street. We soon put the incident behind us, though, and we resume our sleepover activities. Minnie's parents stocked up on junk food, sodas, and even bought a few rounds of table pizzas for us, so this was a pretty big deal. We'd been watching movies, playing video games, talking about boys, and in general just doing the typical sleepover shenanigans before everyone had a smartphone. It was now around 10:30 though, and we were being quite loud if I'm being honest, and Minnie's mum comes in and tells us to be quiet, and not long after quieting down, I start feeling just really uncomfortable. Not to sound generic, but I just had a strong feeling of being watched. Minnie had a big queen-size bed in her room, and the bed was against the wall with the window. Her window had blinds and some sheer curtains, and both were closed. The three of us are on her bed just watching a scary movie. I can't remember what movie we were watching, but it was adding to my anxiety. I ask Minnie and Val if they're feeling like they're being watched, and they say no, and not to be scared, it's just a movie. Roughly 15 more minutes pass, and I'm still trying to calm myself down when suddenly we hear what I can describe as the squeaking sound made when you rub your hand down a window. We all looked at each other, scared stiff, and Val was next to the window and whispers that it wasn't her and that the sound was coming from outside. She slowly moves away from the window. Minnie quickly gets her courage and says that she'll look out the window and that it was probably the neighbors or something. I'm directly behind Minnie because I'm curious, and she leans forward and pulls down one of her blinds. And what we see makes us both scream at the top of our lungs, because, just like out of a horror movie, there's a face just looking straight back at us. Since it was already dark, we couldn't really see the rest of the face, only the eyes and the top part of the nose, and yep, it was crooked. It was definitely the guy that we saw earlier. He stays at the window for a few seconds laughing, and we all jump off of a bed and run into the living room screaming the whole time. Minnie's parents rush out asking what happened, and we all do our best to tell them while still screaming and hyperventilating. It was him, the guy from the park, we said. I keep repeating this to their mum as their dad runs outside. After this, I really don't remember too much. I only remember being so scared and just crying, and I think the cops were called, but I don't know if they ever caught the guy. After this incident too, Minnie and Val were just too scared to sleep in their own rooms and slept on the floor of their parents' room. I was also too scared to go over, so we didn't have our sleepovers for a long time after that. I used to wonder, though, just how he found us, but since we were being so loud and Minnie's room faced the street, it's possible that he heard us and came over. I have no idea how long he'd been outside of her window just watching us, and I kind of don't want to know if I'm being honest. Minnie and I haven't talked about this since it happened, and sadly she's moved out of the area, so we don't talk much these days. Anyway, it was a creepy experience, and one that I definitely don't want to relive. I think that I should probably start this by telling you that I live in a pretty rural area. I live with my younger brother and my dad, and it's not literally farmland or anything, but it's a small town in Scotland by the sea. And typically, not much goes amiss around here, except for drunk people regularly getting rescued from the large hill with a large amount of steep drops that they felt inclined to climb in the pitch dark. But apart from that, it's just a pretty quiet place. A nice place, in fact. But now, I'm paranoid as all hell. So somebody knocked hard on the door at night, like real hard, startled me out of my sleep, and at first I was thinking that I'd slept in and it was the post and I did nothing. I just thought that my dad would get it, or probably for him anyways. But then they knocked again, and it was then that I realized that everybody else was asleep and it was still dark outside. They knocked again and then again, and now I'm sure that it's got to be the police or something like that. It has to be. There's another knock, and then they try the handle. The door isn't locked too, so I can't take it anymore. I'm up out of bed with clothes on and reaching for the handle myself. I know, probably not the smartest thing to do, being as young as I was and a female. But I was still not totally awake and absolutely terrified that someone was going to come into our house or something, rob it whilst I was laying awake. So I, a 17-year-old girl, very carefully opened the door. And there he is, the guy. He's wearing a grey puffer jacket with a jumper underneath, I think. If I remember correctly, he's got glasses on his face, sort of half bald. He says hi, and I reply with a hello, and I'm not quite scared just yet because I've still only been up for a few minutes, but looking back on it now, I have no idea why I wasn't immediately compelled to just slam the door in his face. He definitely wasn't the police or anything, and he wasn't anyone official, but I got to admit that I was a little curious. And then he spoke again, and he said, "The young lassie ran up this way. Your house was the only one with the light on. She didn't come in here, did she? I parked my car on the street and she bolted." I replied no, and he swore and talked about something to do with how he'd seen her go up this way again, and that perhaps she'd jumped the fence in our back garden or something. And then he just left. I don't think he said sorry for disturbing you or anything like that before he just walked away, heading out our garden and back onto the street again. I think, but I'm not too sure about that. I immediately shut the door and just sort of stood there. I was certainly awake at this point. My dad is now up, and I tell him what happened. He asks if I'm okay, as I think he could see that I was pretty wired. I lock the door, check all the windows are shut, try to go back to bed, but
It just won't work, so I get myself a water and here I am, just thoroughly shaken. And I'm still racking my brain over the question of, was the man lying or was he telling the truth? And which one of these options is worse?